Well, hello there. Come on in, get yourself as cozy as you like tonight. Maybe pull the blanket up just a little higher, or dim that one last light still burning in the corner. I've been saving a quiet little story for you, and honestly, I think tonight is exactly the right night for it. Somewhere in the north of England in the year 1842, a young woman opened her eyes before the sun did. No clock told her to wake. No bell from the mill called her name. And for 6 long days every week her whole life had belonged to someone else. 12 hours a day inside a building that never seemed to rest its machines, groaning through the night like something alive. But this one morning was different, and by the time we finish tonight I think you will understand exactly why an entire town would hold its breath just to feel this single day arrive. Now, before we step softly into her house together, if these slow, gentle little windows into the past are the kind of thing that helps you unwind, I would love it if you considered tapping that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means quite a lot on my end. A quiet like or even a short comment left just before you drift off lets me know you are out there somewhere in the dark listening. And that honestly is one of the nicest feelings in the world for someone telling stories to what often feels like an empty room. So tell me, where are you tonight? Already tucked into bed, driving home after a long shift, folding laundry with one earbud in? I always wonder about that. All right, my friend, let's turn the lights down just a touch more. Let the fan hum soft in the background, and let's step quietly into that Sunday morning together. The house stood near the end of a narrow lane, one of dozens of brick houses built quickly, cheaply, and near one another the way entire streets were built wherever a factory needed hands close by. Her name was Eliza. She was 22 years old, and for the first time all week she woke without that familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came from knowing the day did not belong to her. Outside, the town was still dark, still holding on to the last soft edges of night. Somewhere down the lane a rooster called out to no one in particular, a little too pleased with itself for the hour. Eliza sat up slowly in the narrow bed she shared with her younger sister, and for one long soft moment she simply listened. No looms turning below her, no overseer's boots on the stairs, just quiet. Thick, strange quiet, almost too much of it for someone whose ears had spent 6 days learning to live inside noise. Downstairs, her mother was already awake, kneeling at the cold hearth, coaxing a small fire back to life with hands that never quite lost their redness from years of hot water and coarse soap. There was a rhythm to this one that had nothing to do with the mill and everything to do with love. First, the fire, then the water. One basin filled and warmed just enough would serve the whole family this morning passed gently from person to person, because in a house like theirs that was simply how 6 people managed to feel clean before the day properly began. And here is a small detail worth sitting with for a moment. In working homes across industrial England during those years, warm water for washing was never a small thing. It was closer to a quiet luxury saved and shared, never wasted on a single face when 5 more were waiting their turn. A splash on the cheeks, a scrub behind small ears, and always the same gentle scolding from mother about cold water building character. Eliza used to roll her eyes at that particular lecture. Now 22 and tired in a way her mother understood better than almost anyone alive, she found herself halfway believing it. The room itself was small, low-ceilinged, and honest about what it was. 2 rooms downstairs, nothing more. A stitched sampler hung crooked above the mantel sewn by a grandmother. None of the younger children had ever met her. Careful little letters faded now to the colour of weak tea. On the shelf beside it sat a small clock that had stopped keeping time years earlier and never once got fixed, because a household ruled all week by the mill's own bell had never really needed one. A dresser in the corner held a few mismatched cups and plates chipped in places cared for anyway. Her father sat near the fire lacing his boots, a man whose hands never quite lost their faint smell of machine oil, no matter how hard he scrubbed them the night before. All week he climbed among the iron gears and leather belts of the mill, keeping the great machines turning for other people's profit, his knuckles forever nicked and blackened. But this morning in the low orange light of the fire, his hands looked almost soft, almost like anyone else's hands. It was a small thing. It mattered anyway. Then came the clothes. At the bottom of a small wooden chest, wrapped carefully in an old length of cloth to keep away the damp, sat the one thing this family owned that had nothing to do with survival: their Sunday clothes. For 6 days, everyone in that house wore whatever kept them warm enough to work, patched at the elbows, faded at the knees, the colour of coal dust no matter how many times it was scrubbed away. But this one set of clothing, worn only on this one day, was different. It was pressed with care the night before. It was folded like something precious. It was in its own small way a kind of dignity that no factory floor could ever quite reach. Her younger brother, only 9 years old, hated his collar with his whole small heart. He tugged at it the moment their mother turned her back, muttering under his breath that he would rather shovel coal all morning than wear something so stiff around his neck. Their father, standing near a small cracked mirror with a straight razor in hand, muttered something back about how the boy had clearly never actually shoveled coal in his life, and promptly nicked his own chin for being distracted mid-sentence. Their mother didn't even look up from the fire. She simply said, without missing a beat, that a man who talked while he shaved deserved exactly what he got. Eliza laughed quietly, the kind of laugh you keep small on purpose so it doesn't wake the whole street. It was, she realized, the first time all week she had laughed at anything at all. Later, once the children were dressed and fed, Eliza's mother finally turned to her own small corner of the room, where a second dress softer and a little less faded than the rest of her wardrobe hung waiting on a nail behind the door. It was a deep plum colour, the sort of shade she never would have chosen for a workday, and it had been mended so many times over the years that the stitching told its own quiet story. Eliza helped pin her mother's hair up at the back, the way she'd done every Sunday since she was old enough to hold a pin steady. For 6 days her mother was a pair of hands too bent over a washtub or a factory bench known by her surname and little else. But standing there in the low morning light, smoothing down her one good dress, she looked just for a few minutes like a woman with a whole life outside of work. Eliza thought quietly that she hoped to look exactly like that one day, but the real work of the morning was already happening on the kitchen table, where her mother had returned to rub coarse salt into a modest joint of meat, tucking a handful of small potatoes and a few carrots around it in an old tin pan. This was the one meal of the week that felt less like fuel to keep tired bodies moving and more like a small, quiet celebration. And here is the part that tends to surprise people when I tell it. Very few homes on a street like theirs owned an oven large enough to properly roast that meat. So every single Sunday there was only one thing to be done about it. Before the church bells had even begun their calling, mothers and daughters all along that lane would carry their wrapped tins down to the local baker, a man who kept his great brick oven burning anyway, and for a small coin, or sometimes simply as a kindness passed between neighbours, he would slide each family's dinner in among his loaves of bread. By the time everyone returned from church, hours later, the whole street would smell of roasting meat and fresh bread drifting out through open doors and cracked windows, as though the entire town were quietly cooking one enormous shared meal together. Eliza carried their tin that morning, her mother walking half a step behind her arms, folded against the chill breath rising in soft little clouds in front of her face. Neither of them said much. They did not need to. There was something almost sacred about that short walk past neighbours doing the very same thing, nodding good morning, comparing whose joint of meat looked the finest this week, laughing softly over whose children had scrubbed up the cleanest. A neighbour named Mrs. Whitfield fell into step beside them for a moment, balancing her own tin against one hip, and leaned in close enough to whisper that she had added a spoonful of honey to her pudding. This week, a small secret she was clearly proud of and just as clearly hoping someone would ask about. Eliza's mother laughed under her breath and promised not to tell a soul, which in a street this small everyone understood was a kind and gentle lie. And maybe that's the part of this story I love most. For 6 days Eliza had simply been a pair of hands at a loom replaceable exhausted counted among hundreds of others just like her. But on this one morning, carrying a small tin of salted meat down a quiet lane beside her mother, she was something else entirely. A daughter, a neighbour, a young woman with a name that mattered to somebody. It is worth remembering just for a moment what an ordinary week looked like for a family such as this one. 12 hours a day, 6 days straight, very little in the way of choice about any of it. Historians studying towns exactly like this one have noted again and again how thin the line grew between simply working and simply surviving. Against a week built that way, a single unhurried morning spent walking beside your own mother with nowhere urgent to be was not a small thing at all. It was in its own quiet fashion the 1 hour of the week that still belonged entirely to her. By the time they reached the baker's shop, warm light had just begun to spill across the rooftops, catching on chimney smoke that curled up lazy and slow into a pale waking sky. The baker Flower dusted across both forearms greeted them by name, the way he greeted nearly everyone, because in a town built almost entirely around one mill, there were very few secrets left between neighbours and even fewer strangers. Eliza handed over their tin, watched it disappear into that great glowing mouth of an oven, alongside a dozen others, and felt just for a moment a strange and gentle comfort in knowing her family's dinner now sat beside her neighbour's own, all cooking, together all waiting patiently through the same quiet hours. Outside the street had begun to properly stir now, doors opening one by one all down the lane, children being buttoned into coats far too tight around their growing shoulders, a cat stretching itself along a windowsill as though it too understood something had shifted about this particular morning. Somewhere close by a baby cried and was just as quickly hushed. Chimney smoke thickened above the rooftops, drifting sideways in the pale light, carrying with it the first faint trace of roasting meat from a dozen ovens at once. And then low and steady rolling out over the rooftops and chimney tops of that entire industrial town came the very first sound of the day that truly belonged to everyone, rich or poor, tired or rested. A church bell. Eliza stopped walking for just a second, listening, watching her own breath fade slowly into the cold morning air. Because that single bell ringing slow and patient across the whole town was about to call every soul on that street toward the one place where this day's real rules, its comforts and its quiet little rebellions were only just about to begin. That single bell did not stay alone for long. One by one across rooftops and chimney stacks, other bells answered it back, scattered like a conversation passed from steeple to steeple down the whole valley, by the time Eliza and her mother turned back onto their own street. The quiet morning had already begun to fill with people, all moving in loose, unhurried streams toward whichever building called them by name. Doors opened up and down the lane one after another, releasing families dressed in the same careful, cherished clothing Eliza's own household had spent the last hour preparing. An older neighbour leaned heavily on a walking stick, guided along by a granddaughter, who clearly considered this her most important duty of the week. 2 young men, hair slicked flat with water, and a good deal of effort, tried very hard to look as though they had not spent several minutes arguing over a shared collar in front of a cracked bit of mirror. Somewhere behind them a dog trotted along at the edge of the crowd, uninvited but entirely unbothered by that fact, clearly under the impression that Sunday belonged to everyone, including him. And here is something worth noticing right away, something most people picture wrong when they imagine mornings like this one. We tend to picture a single church, a single congregation, everyone dressed the same, walking the same road, believing the same thing in exactly the same way. The truth of a town such as Eliza's was far more interesting than that, because if you had stood on the corner of her street and simply watched, you would have seen the whole town quietly sort itself in two directions without a single person needing to be told which way to go. Up the hill, where the road turned to good cobblestone and the houses grew taller and cleaner, with every step stood the old stone parish church, its tower older than anyone alive could remember its bell, the deepest and grandest of all of them. That was where the mill owner walked with his family, where the doctor and the schoolmaster and the more comfortable shopkeepers gathered in their good wool coats, nodding to one another by title, rather than by first name the way people do when everyone present already knows exactly where everyone else stands. Down the other way, past the canal, past the last row of houses before the fields opened up, sat a much plainer building, brick rather than stone, with a modest little sign above the door reading Bethel Chapel. Which one do you suppose Eliza and her mother turned toward that morning? I've a feeling you already guessed correctly before I even finished the sentence. That was where Eliza's family was headed, along with most of the mill hands on their street, the weavers and spinners and mechanics who kept the great machines turning all week long. Two churches barely a mile apart and in more ways than one, two entirely different worlds sharing the very same town. I find that particular detail worth sitting with for a moment because it quietly breaks a comfortable little myth many of us carry about the past without ever questioning it. We like to imagine faith back then as something that erased class completely, one great equal congregation kneeling side by side before something larger than themselves. In practice, it rarely worked quite that way. Many parish churches of this period rented out their pews by the year front rows, going to families who could pay the most for the privilege, while poorer members of the congregation stood at the back or squeezed onto plain benches near the door, close enough to hear every word yet somehow still reminded exactly where they belonged. A family might pay a fair sum each year simply to keep the same reserved bench generation after generation, the same way a modern family might keep a subscription running out of habit as much as need. There is a story still told in some of these old parish records of a family who fell behind on their pew payment for 2 years, running only to arrive one Sunday and find a small brass plate with a stranger's name fixed neatly where their own had once sat. Nobody shouted about it. Nobody needed to. Everyone in that congregation understood without a single word spoken exactly what had happened and why. Even inside a building meant to remind everyone that they stood equal before something greater than themselves. The world outside had a stubborn habit of following people in through the front door. That more than anything else is likely why so many working families like Eliza's found their way instead toward a small chapel such as Bethel. No rented pews there, no quiet distinction between whose family sat nearest the front. Just plain wooden benches shoulder to shoulder, mill hands, and their children packed in together until the room grew warm simply from the number of bodies inside it, since heating a building that size with coal was an expense few chapels of this kind could easily manage on their own. Picture it with me for a moment if you would. Low-ceiling whitewashed walls, a single small stove glowing somewhere near the front doing very little against the chill, breath rising in soft clouds above every head, much the way it had outside on the walk over, and yet somehow none of that seemed to matter once the first hymn began. Because if there was one thing a chapel like Bethel offered that the grand stone church up the hill rarely could, it was sound. Real full unpolished sound, dozens of tired voices rising together at once, untrained and occasionally off-key and completely unconcerned about it. This was not an accident of taste. Chapels belonging to this newer, more heartfelt style of worship leaned heavily on hymn singing precisely because so many of their members had never learned their letters, and a melody repeated week after week could carry meaning into a person's memory in a way that printed words on a page never quite managed to. A verse learned through song stayed with a person long after any sermon had faded from memory. Eliza's mother sang louder than anyone on their row, a woman who spent 6 days a week barely speaking, above the roar of machinery finally allowed to raise her voice for something other than simply being heard over a loom. I always find that particular detail almost impossible not to love. A woman with so little that belonged only to her, and yet for a few minutes each week her own voice was entirely hers to spend any way she pleased. Have you ever sat somewhere and felt an entire room hold one single imperfect note together? There is something in that kind of shared unpolished sound that steadies a person, even now, even in a world full of every other kind of noise imaginable. I suspect that is exactly why it mattered so much back then too, perhaps even more than it does today. Now the sermon itself is where I want to slow down and offer you something a touch more honest than the postcard version of history usually bothers to give us. It is easy enough to assume every word spoken from a pulpit in a town like this one concerned only matters of the next life, purely spiritual, entirely removed from the machinery down the road. But historians who study mill towns from this period point to something a little more layered sitting underneath the surface. Employers, in more than a few cases documented from the era, openly encouraged their workers towards steady church-going, and it was not purely out of concern for anyone's soul. Some mill owners went as far as building and partly funding chapels of their own right, alongside workers' cottages, almost as part of the machinery of the town itself. A workforce that spent its one free day sitting quietly absorbing messages about patience, discipline, obedience, and the plain virtue of steady labour, tended to return to the mill on a Monday morning considerably easier to manage than one that had spent its Sunday any way it pleased. I share that not to strip anything of its meaning, because I do not believe it deserves to be stripped of one. Faith inside that chapel for a woman like Eliza's mother was almost certainly real comforting, and entirely her own regardless of who paid for the roof over her head that morning. But history rarely hands us one single clean motive for anything, and I think it does this whole story more justice to admit that both things were probably true at once, sitting quietly side by side. A room full of honest belief resting inside a system that also happened to find that same belief rather convenient. The service itself ran long by modern standards, often well past an hour, sometimes closer to 2. Once prayers, readings, and several hymns were all counted together. Children fidgeted on hard wooden benches. Boots grew cold against stone or bare wooden floors. And for many families this was only the first gathering of the day, not the last, since chapel-goers in towns like this one frequently returned again in the evening for a second service, turning Sunday into something closer to 2 church visits stitched together around one long quiet afternoon in between, with the youngest children often sent off separately in the middle hours for their own simpler lesson, learning their letters from Bible verses the same way an older brother might once have learned his from a factory foreman's shouted instructions. That evening, gathering carried its own particular feeling quite different from the crowded brightness of the morning. Candles and oil lamps replaced daylight along the walls, throwing soft moving shadows across the whitewash, and the singing somehow always sounded a touch gentler once the sun had gone down, as though the whole congregation understood without being told that this second service belonged more to comfort than to duty. I think it is worth pausing here to say plainly what I believe this hour or two inside a small brick chapel actually meant beyond the singing and the sermon and the cold stone floor. For 6 days, Eliza was simply a pair of hands at a loom. Her mother was simply a pair of hands at a washtub. Inside Bethel Chapel, packed shoulder to shoulder with neighbours who understood exhaustion, the same way they did something closer to equality, quietly took hold, not because anyone declared it so, but because everyone in that room had earned their seat the very same way through 6 days of the very same kind of tiredness. It never fully erased the world waiting outside those doors, but for an hour it thinned it considerably, and I suspect that mattered more to the people sitting on those benches than any sermon spoken above their heads. Eliza's own younger brother, the same one who fought so bitterly with his collar, that morning spent most of the sermon studying a small beetle that had wandered across the floor near his boot, clearly far more interested in its slow, determined journey than in anything being said from the front of the room. His mother caught him twice, and both times gave him the exact same look every mother in every century has apparently perfected without ever needing lessons in it. Now here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I would honestly love to know what you think, so feel free to drop it in the comments if the mood takes you. Do you imagine everyone in a town like this truly rested completely and fully on that one protected day? It is a lovely picture, isn't it? A whole town machines silent, everyone gathered peacefully in worship or quiet rest exactly as the rules intended. The truth once again turns out to be a little more tangled than that. In parts of industrial England during exactly these years, certain trades quietly kept working straight through Sunday, hidden well enough to avoid drawing too much attention from anyone who might object. Cloth manufacturers in some northern towns, for instance, were known to stretch and dry finished fabric on a Sunday, specifically because the government inspectors responsible for checking quality never came around on the one day everything was officially supposed to be shut. And Sunday's rules always carried their own quiet exceptions besides. A farmer's cows did not know or care what day it was, and needed milking whether the church bells were ringing or not. A baker's oven ironically stayed lit precisely, so that every family's dinner could be cooked in time for their return from worship, meaning someone somewhere was always working just enough to let everyone else rest. It is a small, almost mischievous detail, but I think it tells us something true about people in nearly every era we might care to study. Rules about rest, no matter how sincerely believed in, have never once stopped every single person from finding a quiet way around them when profit or plain necessity demanded it. By the time the final hymn had faded and the chapel doors opened again, the sun had climbed higher, and the whole street outside seemed to have changed colour, somehow warmer, softer, filled now with families spilling out of doorways in every direction, calling greetings to one another across the road, children finally released from an hour of forced stillness and immediately making up for lost time with a burst of noise their mothers pretended not to notice. Eliza's brother took off running the moment his boots touched the street, weaving between neighbours with the particular energy of a boy who had just sat still for far longer than his body considered fair. Her mother called after him once, mostly out of habit, then let it go, since even she seemed unwilling to spend a single ounce of this precious day scolding anyone for being happy. Eliza stepped outside beside her mother, blinking against the brighter light, and noticed something new drifting through the air, something that had not been there earlier that morning. Somewhere beneath the smell of coal smoke and damp stone threading through the whole street, now came the unmistakable smell of meat slowly turning golden inside an oven, not far from where they stood, mixing with fresh bread, and something faintly sweet besides calling every family on that lane home toward the one meal of the week they'd all been quietly waiting for since the moment their dinner tins disappeared into the baker's fire. The line outside the baker's door was already 3 families deep by the time Eliza and her mother arrived, everyone still smelling faintly of chapel dust and cold pew wood. all of them wearing that same particular kind of patient smile a promised meal tends to produce in people who have waited for it properly. When their turn finally came, the baker lifted their tin free from the great brick oven, with a folded cloth steam rising off the top of it in a soft cloud, and set it down on the counter with the same small flourish he probably used for every single family that morning, as though each dinner handed back across that counter was the only one he had cooked all day. He asked, as he always did, whether Eliza's mother had remembered to tuck in enough potatoes this week, a small joke between them that had apparently been running for years, judging by how little either of them laughed at it anymore, and yet neither seemed willing to let it go either. A coin or two changed hands hardly more than the price of a loaf of bread, and Eliza carried the tin home cradled carefully against her chest, switching hands twice along the way when the heat crept through the cloth wrapped around it, muttering something under her breath that made her mother laugh out loud on a public street, an event rare enough that two neighbours turned to look. Inside their own small kitchen, the table had already been set with whatever plates the household owned that matched closely enough not to matter, and her father settled himself at the head of it the moment his boots were off the same seat he occupied at every meal all week, though on most days that seat came with nothing much worth sitting down for. A short blessing was said, quiet and quick, more habit than performance, her father's eyes drifting open a half-second early, the way they always did to check on the meat before the last word had even properly landed. Her mother pretended not to notice the same way she pretended not to notice every single Sunday. And then finally the tin was opened. Now here is where I want to slow this whole story down, because I think the actual eating of that dinner tells us something about this family and about thousands of families exactly like them that all the church bells and chapel benches in the world could never quite explain on their own. Her father took up the carving knife, an object that stayed tucked away in a drawer untouched for 6 days, and only ever appeared on this one afternoon, and set to work slicing the meat with the careful, slightly self-conscious concentration of a man who took this particular duty seriously, whether or not he would ever admit that out loud to anyone else. There is something worth noticing in the way portions landed on each plate that day too, something a modern table would likely find a little uncomfortable. The largest, thickest slice went to her father, the household's main wage earner, followed closely by the next largest, to whichever child was already old enough to work half days at the mill. Steam curled up off the meat with every slice the knife carried away, catching the light from the small window above the sink, and the sound of the blade meeting the wooden board beneath it became for a few minutes the only sound in the whole room, everyone else watching in a silence that had nothing to do with impatience and everything to do with quiet anticipation. It was not born of favoritism so much as arithmetic. A body doing hard physical labour 6 days a week needed more on its plate than a body that was not, and in a household counting every ounce as carefully as this one did, fairness and survival did not always mean the exact same thing. Conversation drifted easily once everyone had a plate in front of them, the way it always seemed to on this one day, and almost never managed to on the others. Her father asked without much real interest whether the sermon had run long that morning, and her mother answered honestly that she had stopped counting the minutes somewhere around the second hymn. Eliza's younger brother, mouth still half full, tried to explain the entire journey of his beetle across the chapel floor in more detail than anyone at that table had requested, and nobody once told him to stop. Before the meat even reached the table, though there had been another course, entirely one that might surprise you, if you have only ever known Yorkshire pudding as a small golden side dish sitting politely beside the roast. In households like Eliza's, it was often served first on its own, drenched simply in gravy, eaten before a single slice of meat had even been carved. The reasoning behind that was wonderfully practical rather than fancy. Meat being the most expensive item on the table by a wide margin needed to be stretched as far as it possibly could. A generous filling dish of baked batter made from little more than flour, eggs and milk cost almost nothing by comparison, yet filled a hungry stomach enough to make the meat that followed feel like plenty, even when the joint itself was fairly modest. It was in its own quiet way one of the cleverest pieces of household economy the era ever produced, dressed up today as tradition born originally out of necessity. And that word necessity brings me to something I think is worth pausing on directly, because it is easy to watch a scene like this one and assume every day of Eliza's week looked something close to this. It did not. For most families on that street, the 6 days leading up to Sunday looked entirely different at the table. Breakfast was often little more than bread spread with dripping saved carefully from the last roast rather than butter, washed down with tea brewed weak enough to be used twice over the leaves stretched until barely any colour remained in the cup. Dinner during the week, if it came at all in any proper sense, might be potatoes, a little oatmeal, occasionally a thin broth. If bones were available to boil, sometimes nothing more exciting than bread and a scrape of cheese, eaten standing up between one task and the next. Meat, real meat, sliced and served warm on a plate, was rare enough during the working week that surveys of households from this period, conducted later in the century by social researchers looking closely at industrial diets, found that many working families saw meat on their table only once or twice a week at most, and for the poorest among them, not even that often. There is something almost unsettling about picturing an entire household counting down 6 days toward a single plate of food, and yet that same waiting, I think, is exactly what made the meal taste the way it did. Sunday, in other words, was not simply a pleasant meal. It was for a great many families like Eliza's the only real meal of the entire week. Can you imagine planning your whole week around a single dinner? I find that almost impossible to picture properly, and yet if you think about it for a moment, there is something in that feeling most of us still understand on some smaller scale even now. That particular ache of looking forward to one good thing, counting down toward it, making it mean more precisely because everything around it was harder, and dinner itself did not always end with the meat and vegetables either. For families who could manage it, a small pudding often followed something sweet and simple. A spoonful of treacle stirred through a steamed batter, or plain rice cooked slowly in milk until it thickened, sweetened with whatever sugar the household could spare that week. It was never elaborate. It rarely needed to be. A little sweetness at the very end of the one proper meal of the week carried more weight than its size would ever suggest. And Eliza's brother, half asleep, though he already was by that point, always seemed to find just enough energy left in him for a second helping of whatever pudding appeared. Now, where exactly did this whole custom begin in the first place? Historians studying English food traditions tend to offer two different answers, and honestly, I find both of them worth telling you, because neither one cancels the other out completely. The oldest story reaches back to medieval England, where legend holds that village workers given Sunday free from their labour for the local lord gathered afterward to feast on roasted meat, sometimes a whole ox shared among the group, a custom some historians connect loosely to the origin of the nickname given to the royal guards of England, who were said to eat so generously that they earned the affectionate title still used today, roughly meaning eaters of beef. One cookery writer from the early years of the 1800s even left behind detailed instructions for roasting a heavy joint of sirloin over an open fire for a full 4 hours, the kind of method that demanded a fireplace large enough that only the wealthiest households of the period could ever hope to manage it properly at home, which tells you something important about who these earlier, grander versions of the tradition were originally built for. The newer story, and the one that fits Eliza's world far more closely, places the true rise of this tradition several centuries later during the very industrial years we've been walking through together tonight, when families without proper ovens of their own began the practice of placing their joint of meat into cook before leaving for church timing. An entire dinner around a morning service in exactly the way we just watched happen. I will admit of the two, it is the second story that moves me more, not because the older legend is not charming, but because there is something quietly remarkable about a tradition built not by wealth or royal appetite, but by ordinary families solving an ordinary problem one Sunday at a time, until the solution itself became something worth cherishing. There is a lighter thread woven through this whole story too, one that always makes me smile a little when I come across it. Across the water in France, the English earned themselves a nickname of their own, largely on account of exactly this habit, being teasingly called, roughly translated, the roast beef's a label that has stuck in one form or another for a very long time, now worn these days almost as a badge of honour rather than an insult. Now, nothing about that Sunday joint of meat went to waste once the plates were finally cleared, and I think this next part says just as much about the character of families like Eliza's as the dinner itself did. Whatever remained once everyone had eaten their fill was carefully wrapped and set aside, destined to reappear, sliced thin and cold inside a lunch pail come Monday morning, tucked between two pieces of bread for whoever was heading back to the mill. By midweek the last of it might be chopped fine and mixed through potatoes for another modest supper, and any leftover vegetables from the Sunday plate rarely survived past Monday evening. Either, since fried together with cold potato in a hot pan they made a simple filling dish that households across the country cooked so often, it eventually earned its own cheerful little nickname, one still spoken fondly in kitchens today. One Sunday joint stretched carefully across several days without anyone ever quite naming it leftovers, since in a household like this one nothing that could still nourish a person was ever spoken of as waste. Even the fat rendered down from the roasting pan found its own second life spread thin across bread the following morning. Treasured in a way that might strike us as strange today, though, anyone who grew up watching their own grandparents save exactly this kind of thing will likely recognize the instinct immediately. It is worth remembering too that this particular dinner looked rather different depending on which part of the country you happened to call home. Families further north in Scotland were far more likely to gather around lamb with a bright sharp mint sauce rather than beef. In parts of Wales, the same Sunday tradition often included laverbread, a delicacy made from seaweed served alongside cockles gathered from the coast, a version of Sunday dinner that would have looked almost unfamiliar to a family in Eliza's part of England, despite both tables sharing the very same underlying purpose. Down in Cornwall, some households cook their potatoes directly beneath the meat itself, letting them soak up every last drop of fat and juice as it dripped down through the pan, a method locals were rightly proud of and outsiders were rarely told the secret to. The meal changed shape from valley to valley, coastline to coastline, yet the reason behind it, one hard-earned pause worth gathering the whole family around, stayed remarkably consistent everywhere you looked. If you had grown up in a house like this one, which version do you imagine you would have loved most? By the time Eliza's family finished eating that afternoon, the tin scraped nearly clean. Her father leaned back in his chair with the particular satisfied stillness of a man who had eaten properly for the first time all week, and for a few minutes nobody said very much at all. Her brother full and finally still, after a morning of fidgeting and running, rested his head against the table-edge eyes, half closed in the exact way small children do right before they lose the battle against a nap entirely. It did not need filling with conversation, the quiet itself was the point. But dinner, as it turned out, was really only the halfway marker of this long, carefully guarded day. Because once those plates were cleared away, and the tin set aside for washing a new question, settled quietly over the table, one that every single person in that room had grown up understanding without ever needing it explained aloud. What exactly were they now permitted to do with the rest of their one free afternoon? And perhaps more interestingly, who exactly had decided the answer to that question, long before any of them were even born, and how far were they willing to go quietly behind closed doors to bend it just a little? So when the last of the pudding finally disappeared, and the table sat empty, what exactly was Eliza permitted to do with the rest of her afternoon? Not a great deal, if we're being honest, though. Nobody had ever handed her family a printed list of rules to study. A quiet walk, perhaps, along the canal path, watching the water move slow and brown beneath the mill bridges that stood silent now, their great wheels stopped for the first time in 6 days. A short visit to a neighbour tea offered whether there was much to spare or not. Needlework by the window if the light held out long enough, her mother's fingers moving through fabric with the same careful patience she brought to everything else in her life. Loud laughter was tolerated without much comment. Loud work was not. None of this was written down anywhere in her town, not in the way we usually mean that word. It was something closer to memory passed quietly from one generation of neighbours to the next, the kind of unwritten rule that everyone simply understood and enforced on each other through nothing sharper than a raised eyebrow or a slow shake of the head over a garden fence. Now if you had sailed 3,000 miles west across the ocean, at exactly this same moment into a much younger nation still finding its footing, you would have discovered this very same quiet agreement, written down properly word for word with real penalties attached to every line of it, not memory, law. The story of that law reaches back further than Eliza's century, all the way to 1610, when the colony of Virginia passed what many historians consider the very first Sunday law on this side of the ocean, requiring attendance at church and forbidding what the statute called unnecessary labour, backed by fines for a first offence and considerably harsher punishment, including whipping for anyone foolish enough to repeat it. Think about that contrast for a moment against everything we just watched happen in Eliza's world. Her Sunday was shaped by soft social pressure, the quiet disapproval of neighbours who might mention something later over a fence. Theirs an ocean away and 2 centuries earlier was shaped by the point of a magistrate's pen, with an actual punishment waiting for anyone who mistook a day of rest for a day of choice. By the time New England had properly organised itself decades later, towns across Connecticut had built entire legal codes around this same principle, restricting not just work but travel, recreation and ordinary commerce, all in the name of protecting one single day from the noise of everyday life. These statutes eventually earned themselves a nickname that has outlived nearly everyone who first used it, and I have to tell you, historians still argue about where exactly that nickname came from. Some believe it referred to the colour of the paper certain early legal documents were printed on. Others insist it was something closer to an insult, a mocking jab at the strict, unsmiling moral code associated with a particular group of reformers from the era of Oliver Cromwell people whose critics apparently found about as much warmth in them as the colour itself suggests. Nobody has ever settled the argument for certain, which I personally find rather charming. Even the name of this deeply serious legal tradition carries a small unsolved mystery folded inside it. And these were not laws confined to one old established corner of the country either. As settlers pushed further west throughout the 1800s, brand new states carried the same tradition with them and simply wrote fresh versions into their own law books. Arkansas admitted to the Union only a handful of years before Eliza was even born, passed its own sweeping Sunday statute in 1837, prohibiting nearly every form of sale trade and labour across the entire state, with narrow exceptions carved out only for food medicine and genuine acts of charity. Within a couple of decades, several of these new estates had gone even further, adding hunting and horse racing to their own growing lists of Sunday prohibitions, each legislature apparently convinced its own particular temptation deserved special mention. It is a small detail, but I think it says something rather large. This was never simply an old fading custom clinging on in a few dusty New England towns. It was still being actively written, actively debated and actively enforced right alongside the birth of brand new states at the very same moment Eliza was walking home from her own chapel 3,000 miles away. By the 1800s, the very century Eliza was living through on the other side of the Atlantic, this old colonial idea found new energy in the United States, carried forward by a wave of religious reformers determined to protect what they saw as a day under quiet siege from a rapidly industrializing world. And the list of what these laws eventually reached out to touch grew considerably longer than a modern person might expect. Boxing matches banned, horse racing banned, card playing banned, billiards, dancing, cockfighting, even something as ordinary as bowling, all of it swept in various states and various decades under the same broad umbrella of activities considered unfit for the Lord's Day. Some towns went further still, forbidding hunting, fishing, and eventually, once the technology arrived, even a trip to the local moving picture house. I always find myself smiling a little at the sheer specificity of some of these lists, as though a committee of very serious people had once sat in a very serious room, debating out loud with complete sincerity whether a friendly game of cards on a quiet Sunday afternoon constituted a genuine moral emergency worth writing into state law. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I would love to hear your honest answer in the comments. Who do you imagine benefited most from laws this strict? Most people guess the churches straight away, and you would not be entirely wrong, but there is a second answer sitting right underneath that one, an answer that surprised me the first time I came across it properly, and I think it deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Because alongside the preachers and moral reformers pushing for these laws, you would also have found something far less expected standing shoulder to shoulder with them quietly but firmly. Labour unions, working men who had absolutely no interest in sermons or scripture, but every interest in the world in making sure their employer could not legally demand a seventh day of unpaid unbroken labour from them. Organisations representing everyone from dock workers to railway men lobbied right alongside church groups for exactly these statutes, an alliance that must have looked rather strange on paper. Ministers and union organisers signing the same petitions, standing at the same podiums, for entirely different reasons that happen to point toward the very same law. In a rapidly growing industrial economy, where a factory owner might otherwise have every incentive to run machinery every single day of the week, a law that forced the entire business to shut its doors on Sunday was not really about faith at all for these particular supporters. It was protection dressed up in religious language because religious language happened to be the most persuasive argument available at the time. I think that detail changes the whole picture rather nicely. A law we tend to file away in our minds as purely about church and scripture was for a great many working families actually one of the earliest tools this country had for defending something we would now simply call a weekend. But laws built this broadly rarely apply evenly to everyone living under them, and this next part is the piece of the story that I think deserves the most honesty of all. Picture for a moment a young shopkeeper somewhere in a growing American town during these very decades, a man who kept his small store stocked with dry goods and fabric, doing his best to build a modest, respectable living for his family. Now imagine that this man observed his own faith's day of rest on Saturday, shutting his shop from sundown, Friday through sundown the following evening exactly as his own religious tradition required of him. His shelves dark, his ledger, closed a full day of income quietly set aside out of devotion rather than obligation. Under laws like these, he was then required by the state itself to shut his doors all over again the very next day on Sunday, regardless of his own beliefs, simply because the majority around him observed a different calendar. 2 full days lost out of every single week, while his Christian neighbours down the street lost only 1. Multiply that across a full year, and you begin to see the shape of a burden that no lawmaker sitting comfortably inside the religious majority ever had reason to notice, let alone carry themselves. It is a quiet kind of unfairness easy to overlook if you are not the one living inside it, and it sparked real organised opposition beginning around the 1840s, as Jewish communities, along with certain smaller Christian groups, who kept a Saturday Sabbath of their own, began petitioning, publishing and arguing publicly that a law meant to protect religious observance was in their case quietly punishing it instead. Petitions circulated, editorials were written. Small merchants took their arguments directly to state legislatures, asking quite reasonably why devotion to one faith should cost a man twice what devotion to another faith cost his neighbour. It would take many more decades before courts and lawmakers began seriously wrestling with that particular question, and if I am honest with you, some corners of that same argument still surface in different forms even now, whenever a modern business owner asks which days their doors are legally required to stay shut. And enforcement, once these laws were properly written into the books, could grow almost comically specific. In one case that made its way all the way to the highest court in the country, around the turn of the century, a small-town barber kept his shop open on a Sunday morning trimming hair for a handful of customers exactly as he did every other day of the week, only to find himself fined for it, under the very same statutes we've been discussing tonight. His argument, reasonable enough on its face, was that a man needed a decent haircut regardless of which day the calendar happened to land on, and that his work was hardly the sort of thing anyone could call sinful. The court disagreed, ultimately deciding that a haircut did not qualify as a genuine work of necessity or charity, the 2 narrow exceptions most versions of these laws allowed, and the fine was upheld. Sit with that for a second. An entire legal system staffed by serious, educated people, spending real time and real argument determining whether trimming someone's hair counted as sin. I do not say that to mock the seriousness with which people once took their faith. I say it because it shows you exactly how far a good, sincere idea can travel once it gets handed over to lawyers and legislators, stretching further and further from its original spirit. The more precisely everyone tries to define it, I think there is something worth comparing directly here, and it is the kind of comparison that only becomes obvious once you place these 2 worlds side by side. Eliza's Sunday back in her small English mill town was shaped entirely by community memory, by the quiet, unspoken judgment of neighbours who had known her family for years. Nobody arrested her mother for hanging washing on a Sunday morning, though plenty of raised eyebrows might have followed if she had tried it. In America, that exact same instinct toward rest had hardened into something, with teeth into fines courtrooms, and in the earliest years even physical punishment. 2 very different countries built from the very same root idea, one enforced by memory, the other by statute. There is an argument to be made for each approach, and I do not think either one comes out looking entirely clean. A rule enforced only by memory can quietly bend for the wealthy and the well-connected, while pressing hardest on those with the least power to push back. A rule enforced by statute, meanwhile, at least applies to everyone equally on paper, yet as we just saw with that unfortunate barber, and with that shopkeeper caught between 2 Sabbaths, equal application on paper does not always mean equal impact once the law actually lands on real people's lives. Which one do you think would have felt heavier to actually live under the quiet judgment of your neighbours or the formal power of the law itself? I'm honestly not certain there is a comfortable answer to that question, and I'm not sure there needs to be one tonight. What I find myself coming back to again and again whenever I look through old court records and dusty legislative debates from this period is how much genuine tangled human intention sits underneath a single word like rest. Protection for exhausted workers, comfort for the sincerely devout, quiet punishment for anyone whose faith simply did not match the calendar everyone else had agreed upon. All three of those things were true at once, sitting inside the very same set of laws, and I do not think history owes us a version of this story with only one clean moral sitting at the end of it. This argument over exactly how strict a day of rest ought to be did not stay quietly contained on either side of the ocean for very long. Within a few short decades it would cross right back over the Atlantic and land squarely in the middle of English society itself, stirred up further by visiting foreign dignitaries, hopeful new museums wanting to open their doors, and railway companies eager to run excursion trains on the one day everyone happened to be free. It sparked one of the most heated, oddly personal debates of the entire Victorian era over whether a country like Eliza's own was finally ready to loosen its grip on the one day it had spent generations learning to protect so carefully. Word of that very argument eventually reached even a town as small and unremarkable as Eliza's, carried in through newspapers passed hand to hand at the mill gate, recited aloud by whoever among the workers still had their voice left after a long week of shouting over machinery. Eliza's own father held strong opinions on the subject, opinions he was only too happy to share once dinner had properly settled, tapping the folded newspaper against his knee the way a man does when he has decided a point is simply not up for debate regardless of what anyone else at the table might think. Her mother, for her part, mostly listened, though. The occasional raised eyebrow suggested she did not agree with every word of it. Because by the later years of the 1800s a genuine fight had broken out across England, one that had almost nothing to do with America's courtrooms and fines and everything to do with a much simpler, much more personal question. Should a museum be allowed to open its doors on a Sunday? It sounds like such a small thing to argue about, doesn't it? And yet I promise you this particular fight consumed newspaper columns, church pulpits, and Parliament itself for years, pulling in royalty reformers and ordinary working families who, for what felt like the first time in living memory, actually had a real stake in how the argument turned out. Let me set the stage properly. On one side stood an organisation calling itself the Sunday Society, made up largely of reformers, artists, and a fair number of clergymen themselves who believed the strict, tightly shut Sunday inherited from earlier generations was doing more harm than good. Their argument was not that faith did not matter. Their argument was that a working family given exactly one day off in an entire week deserved somewhere worthwhile to spend it, besides the four walls of a chapel and the four walls of home. Museums, art galleries, public parks, even libraries. Almost every one of them sat locked and dark on the one day the people who most needed them were actually free to walk through the door. The society sent petitions to trustees and committees, wrote letters to newspapers, and organised public lectures arguing that a nation truly concerned with the moral welfare of its poorer citizens ought to be handing them books and paintings. Not simply another empty afternoon with nowhere respectable to spend it. Standing directly opposite them with just as much conviction was the Lord's Day Observant Society, an organisation founded early in Queen Victoria's reign that considered any loosening of Sunday's old boundaries a genuine threat to the moral backbone of the entire nation. Its members were not cruel people, and I want to be fair to them here, since it is far too easy looking back from where we sit tonight to paint them simply as villains standing in the way of progress. Many of them had watched firsthand what unregulated leisure could do to a struggling family, a father's wages disappearing into a public house, instead of feeding his children a Sunday spent drinking rather than resting. To this group, a museum opening its doors on a Sunday was not a small harmless convenience. It was the very first crack in a wall that had taken generations to build, and once that wall started coming down, who could say where the collapse would eventually stop? I want you to sit with the practical unfairness sitting quietly underneath this whole argument for just a moment, because I think it is easy to miss if you are not looking closely. A wealthy family in this period could visit a museum whenever they pleased any weekday afternoon they chose, since none of them were standing at a loom or a workbench from dawn until dusk 6 days running. For a family like Eliza's, plainly enough, Sunday was not simply their preferred day for culture and learning, it was their only possible day. Keeping museum doors shut every single Sunday did not protect the working class from some imagined moral danger inside those galleries. In practice, it simply protected the museum from ever being visited by the working class at all. One London institution home to an extraordinary collection of natural specimens and curiosities that working families would otherwise never have seen in their entire lives became something of a rallying point in this exact fight. Reformers pointing to its locked Sunday doors as proof that the country claimed to value education for everyone while quietly reserving it for those who already had the free time to enjoy it, whether or not anyone intended it that way. And I suspect for quite a few of the traditionalists they honestly did not. The result landed exactly the same either way. Now here is a moment from this whole debate that I find almost too good not to tell you properly, because it turned what had been mostly a quiet, respectable disagreement into something closer to a full-blown national spectacle. In the summer of 1891, the German Emperor paid a state visit to England, and as part of his itinerary plans were quietly drawn up for him to tour a large naval exhibition on a Sunday afternoon. A fairly ordinary diplomatic courtesy, by most standards the sort of thing that would barely register as news in most other countries. Word of this leaked out ahead of time, and the reaction across the country was immediate and frankly rather dramatic. Letters flooded newspaper offices. Church leaders spoke out from their pulpits the very next Sunday, some directly naming the visit as an example of exactly the moral decline they'd been warning everyone about for years. The idea that a foreign monarch might be seen strolling through an exhibition hall on England's sacred day of rest struck a great many people as something close to a national embarrassment, regardless of how harmless the actual visit might have been. Under mounting pressure, the Sunday portion of the visit was quietly cancelled altogether, rearranged to another day, entirely as though an entire royal schedule could simply bend around one nation's private argument with itself. One newspaper at the time, clearly sympathetic to the reform side of this whole argument, could not resist a little gentle mockery of the outcome, poking fun at what it called the country's own particular brand of Sunday austerity, an old-fashioned insularity that seemed to its writers at least rather out of step with a modern connected world. Other papers took the opposite view, entirely praising the cancellation as a small but meaningful victory for national character proof that England still knew how to hold its ground even when a visiting emperor's schedule was involved. Can you imagine an entire diplomatic itinerary being quietly rearranged today because a visiting head of state might be seen at a museum on the wrong day of the week? It sounds almost like satire now, and yet at the time this was treated with complete and total seriousness by an enormous share of the population, argued over at breakfast tables in exactly the sort of household Eliza herself grew up in. I I think what makes this whole episode worth lingering on is not really the Emperor at all, who probably cared very little either way about which afternoon he toured a naval display. It is what the incident reveals about how deeply this argument had settled into the country's sense of its own identity. This was never purely a religious dispute by this point, not entirely. It had become tangled up with pride, with a certain idea of Englishness itself, a belief that the strict, quiet Sunday inherited from earlier generations was part of what separated a properly disciplined nation from its livelier, less restrained neighbours across the water. Museums were only the most visible battleground either. Railway companies, sensing profit in every direction, had begun quietly pushing for permission to run more Sunday excursion trains to the coast, giving working families a taste of travel they had never known before, and traditionalists watched that development with exactly the same unease they brought to every other proposed crack in the old routine. And that particular framing deserves a closer look too, because reformers pushing for a more open Sunday were often accused quite deliberately of wanting to import something foreign, something continental, as though a Sunday spent walking through a museum or listening to a public concert was somehow a betrayal of English character, rather than simply a different way of resting. Picture the sort of Sunday found in cities across parts of Europe. During this same period, families gathered in open-air cafes, brass bands playing in public squares, entire streets given over to conversation music, and leisurely strolling, all of it happening quite openly, without a single church bell demanding silence in return. To English reformers, this looked like warmth and community. To English traditionalists, it looked like the first careless step toward losing something the nation had spent centuries carefully building. Opponents openly worried in print and from the pulpit that loosening these restrictions even slightly would eventually invite exactly that kind of loud, cafe-filled entertainment, heavy Sunday onto English soil, a version of the day they considered a genuine step backward rather than forward. The reformers, for their part, argued the exact opposite, that occupying a working family's one free afternoon with something constructive, something educational, was far more likely to prevent trouble than cause it. An idle mind with nowhere respectable to go, they pointed out, tended to find its own entertainment eventually, and that entertainment was rarely a museum. Here is a question I would love your honest opinion on, so do drop it in the comments if you have a moment. Which side of this argument do you think you would have landed on if you had been standing in Eliza's shoes, exhausted after 6 days at a loom, with exactly one afternoon left to spend any way you pleased? Would you have wanted that afternoon spent quietly at home and at chapel, the way generations before you had always spent it? Or would you have wanted the doors of a museum, a park, a public library thrown open to you, even if it meant a little more noise, a little more bustle creeping into the one day that used to belong entirely to silence? I do not think there is a single correct answer sitting at the bottom of that question, and I have come to believe that is precisely why the argument dragged on for as long as it did, spilling across decades, well beyond the 1890s, resurfacing again and again every time someone proposed opening one more park gate or one more gallery door. Both sides, underneath all the noise and the newspaper headlines, were actually trying to protect the very same thing, a working family's one precious day off. They simply disagreed completely about what protecting it should look like in practice. One side wanted to guard that day through stillness and tradition. The other wanted to guard it through opportunity and access. Neither one was arguing in bad faith, not really, even when their language toward each other suggested otherwise. I find myself even now unable to fully side with either camp, and I suspect that discomfort is exactly the point of telling you this story properly, rather than handing you a simple villain and a simple hero. What strikes me most looking back on this whole chapter of the story now is how thoroughly this argument was really about class dressed up as an argument about morality. The people writing passionately about protecting Sunday's sanctity were more often than not people who already had 6 other days a week to enjoy museums, parks, and quiet reflection whenever they pleased. The people fighting hardest to open those doors were the ones who had never once been asked what they actually wanted their own single free day to look like. It is a pattern worth noticing because it tends to repeat itself throughout history, far more often than we would like to admit arguments about morality, that once you look closely enough, turn out to be arguments about who gets to decide how somebody else spends their limited free time. It would take years yet and no small amount of continued argument before the reformers began winning any real ground. A handful of galleries eventually experimented with cautious Sunday afternoon opening hours before the century closed out quietly without much fanfare, almost as though nobody wanted to be seen celebrating the change too loudly in either direction. Progress in this particular story did not arrive as a single dramatic victory. It arrived slowly, one reluctant committee vote at a time, the way most real change in any century actually tends to happen. Unsatisfying as that might feel for anyone hoping for a tidy, clean ending. And here is the small, quiet irony sitting right at the centre of all of it, one that I think deserves the very last word in this part of our story tonight. While grown adults across the entire country argued fiercely over whether a museum door should ever be allowed to open on a Sunday, one particular institution had already settled this exact question for itself, decades earlier without a single headline or parliamentary debate to announce it. Long before anyone thought to ask whether Sunday could hold anything beyond church and quiet, a very different kind of classroom had already been quietly filling every week with the children of families exactly like Eliza's teaching them their letters, teaching them to write their own names properly for the very first time, and teaching them to imagine a life beyond the walls of the very mill that employed their parents. That classroom, as it happens, was not some distant institution Eliza had only heard about second-hand. It was where she herself had learned her letters years earlier, sitting on a hard bench in a cold room, not unlike the one her younger brother now filled every week, tracing the shapes of words with a piece of chalk, while an older girl, barely more than a child herself, guided her hand along the page. Before there was ever a proper schoolroom waiting for children like Eliza, there was Sunday school, and honestly, without it, a great many working families in towns exactly like hers would have grown up entirely unable to read a single word of their own names. Let me take you back a little further, because the story behind this particular classroom deserves more than a passing mention. It begins with a newspaper editor from Gloucester named Robert Raikes, a man who sometime around 1780 found himself deeply troubled by what he witnessed in the poorer corners of his own city. Children as young as 5 years old were already spending their days inside mines and factories, working alongside adults for hours that would strike any of us today as almost unimaginable. And on the rare occasions these same children found themselves briefly unsupervised out on the streets with nothing to occupy them, the results were exactly what you might expect from exhausted, uneducated, unsupervised young people left entirely to their own devices. Raikes had spent time visiting the local prison as part of his work, and by his own account what struck him most was not the hardened criminals inside it, but how many of them had started down that road as neglected, idle children with nowhere useful to put their energy. He began to wonder what might happen if someone simply intervened earlier, before a child's only available lessons came from the street corner. Raikes did not respond to any of this with punishment or scolding. He responded by opening a school small and modest at first meeting, on the one single day these children were not already expected somewhere else, with a shovel or a bobbin in hand. And that particular detail is worth sitting with properly because it explains something we have circled around for several parts of this story now, without ever quite naming directly. Why Sunday? Why did an entire movement built around teaching poor children to read end up meeting on the very day everyone else in this story has spent gathering, resting, eating, and arguing about museums? The answer is almost painfully simple. For the working children of this era, Sunday was not one convenient option among several. It was the only day available at all. The first legal limits on child labour did not arrive until 1802, and even then the law still permitted children to work a full 12 hours a day. That particular ceiling was not lowered again for another 4 decades. Saturday, contrary to what a modern calendar might suggest, was simply another working day. Which meant that for an enormous share of English children throughout this century, one single morning a week represented the entire span of formal education they would ever receive. Can you imagine building your whole future, your entire ability to read a letter from a loved one, or sign your own name on a document around a handful of hours squeezed into one single morning each week? I find that almost impossible to sit with comfortably. And yet that was simply the arithmetic of childhood for so many families exactly like Eliza's. Now these early Sunday schools were not exactly well-funded operations, and the way they managed to function at all says a great deal about the resourcefulness of the people running them. There was rarely enough money for trained teachers, and certainly not enough for proper books beyond the one text nearly every household could scrape together access to a Bible. So the Bible became the textbook doing double duty as both religious instruction and reading primer at once, children sounding out unfamiliar words from Scripture, the same way another child today might sound out words from a picture book. And rather than relying on a single overworked adult to teach an entire room full of children at wildly different levels, the schools developed something closer to a relay system. Older pupils only slightly further along than the little ones beside them, guiding the newest arrivals through their letters, one patient row at a time. You could see exactly this arrangement at work in the very room Eliza's brother sat inside this morning if you looked closely enough. A girl no older than 14 knelt beside a row of younger boys, pointing to each word in turn, with the blunt end of a pencil sounding out the harder ones twice, before moving on patient in a way that felt almost maternal, despite her own young age. Nobody had trained her for this particular role beyond having done it herself the year before. She simply knew because someone had once done the very same thing for her. It was in its own quiet way an entirely self-sustaining little engine of education, built almost entirely out of necessity and goodwill rather than any real institutional funding. The scale this movement eventually reached still catches me off guard every time I look closely at the numbers, and I think it deserves to catch you off guard too. Within roughly the first 5 years of the movement spreading beyond Gloucester, something in the neighbourhood of 250,000 children across England had already passed through a Sunday school classroom. Within 50 years that number climbed past 2 million. By the middle of the century, surveys of English parishes suggested that somewhere close to 3 out of every 4 working-class children were enrolled in one. Sit with that figure for a moment. 3 out of every 4. Not a fringe experiment tucked away in a handful of progressive parishes, but something closer to a quiet national institution, built almost entirely by volunteers, spreading faster than the mills themselves, faster even than the railways that were reshaping the rest of the country during these very same decades. No government committee planned this growth. No single wealthy donor funded it into existence. It simply spread town by town because ordinary people kept showing up week after week to teach children they had no legal or financial obligation to teach at all, and that literacy carried forward long after any particular Sunday morning ended. A woman who once traced her letters on borrowed scripture might 20 years later find herself reading a wage slip closely enough to notice when a foreman had shorted her hours, or writing a careful letter to a sister who had emigrated across the ocean, the kind of letter that could otherwise only have been dictated to a stranger for a fee. Literacy of this kind rarely announced itself as anything dramatic in the moment. It simply sat quietly in the background of an entire adult life, available whenever it happened to be needed, changing the shape of what was possible in ways nobody in that first crowded little classroom could have properly predicted. Here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a second, and I would love to hear where you land on it. What do you think mattered more to a family like Eliza's, the reading and writing these Sunday schools offered, or the simple, rare experience of being handed a little responsibility and respect inside those walls? Because that second part deserves just as much attention as the literacy itself. Children who progressed well enough often graduated into becoming teachers themselves, some of them barely into their teenage years, standing at the front of their own small row of pupils, trusted with actual responsibility in a world that otherwise offered working-class children almost none. Eliza herself had spent 2 full years in exactly that role before her wages at the mill became too necessary to spare a single Sunday morning for anything else, and she still spoke of it quietly as the only time in her young life anyone had ever called her teacher rather than simply girl. For a boy or girl whose entire week outside of Sunday was spent being ordered around by an overseer or a foreman, that one small taste of leadership, of being looked up to rather than simply instructed, carried a weight I do not think we should underestimate. Historians studying this period, including a fair number who were otherwise deeply critical of the era's treatment of ordinary working people, have pointed to Sunday schools as one of the genuine bright spots of the century, an institution that handed real dignity to children. The rest of the world had largely stopped bothering to notice. There was joy woven through this whole system too, and I think it is worth mentioning since so much of what we have discussed together tonight has carried a fairly heavy weight to it. Sunday schools across the country developed their own small traditions over the decades, prize days where well-behaved and hard-working pupils received a book or a small token in front of an audience of proud parents, parades through the town with banners and singing and summer picnics that became for many working-class children the single most anticipated day of their entire year, more eagerly awaited by some than Christmas itself. Eliza still remembered her own, a long walk, out past the edge of town to a field she and her friends were otherwise never permitted to wander so freely, sandwiches wrapped in paper races organised by teachers who normally kept a much sterner classroom face, ribbons pinned to the winners' collars by hands that spent every other day of the week bent over a washtub or a loom just like everyone else's. She remembered the particular exhaustion of that evening too, the good kind that had nothing at all to do with mill work for once in her life, legs aching from running rather than standing voice, hoarse from singing rather than shouting over machinery. I do want to be honest with you about one more layer sitting underneath all of this warmth, because I think the whole picture deserves telling properly, rather than dressed up as pure, uncomplicated kindness. Not every supporter of the Sunday school movement was motivated purely by concern for a child's soul or a child's future. Some factory owners of the period spoke rather openly about how differently their young workers behaved once Sunday schooling had gotten hold of them, describing the change in language that frankly has not aged particularly well, comparing untrained street children to something closer to wild animals before their education began, and something far more manageable and obedient once it had taken hold. There is something quietly uncomfortable in realizing that the very same institution capable of handing a working-class child genuine dignity was at the very same moment being praised by other men purely for how much easier it made that child to manage on a factory floor. I share that not to spoil the genuine good this movement did, because I firmly believe it did a great deal of good, but because history rarely hands us a single clean motive for anything, and a story told honestly has to make room for the uncomfortable alongside the admirable. What I keep coming back to, turning this whole idea over in my mind, is how neatly it connects to almost everything we have already walked through together tonight. The pew rents inside a parish church, the locked doors of a museum on a Sunday afternoon. Underneath every single one of these stories sits the very same quiet question: who gets access and who does not? Sunday school, in its own modest, unglamorous way, answered that question for England's poorest children decades before anyone in Parliament had even agreed to properly argue about it for the adults, and it did so using nothing more than one borrowed room, one worn Bible, and a handful of teenagers barely older than the pupils they taught. That particular chapter of the story, interestingly enough, did not last forever in quite the same shape. Once proper compulsory schooling finally arrived across the country, in the 1870s, weekday classrooms took over the job of teaching children their letters, and Sunday school gradually narrowed back down into something closer to its original religious purpose: alone prayers and scripture rather than reading primers. In a strange, quiet way, the movement had succeeded itself into a smaller role, having helped push the entire country toward believing every child deserved an education in the first place, whether or not that education still happened to fall on a Sunday. While Eliza's brother sat cross-legged on that chapel floor learning his letters from borrowed scripture, though somewhere across the very same town and across countless towns exactly like it, throughout England, another set of children were spending their own Sunday mornings in an entirely different fashion altogether. No shared Bible passed between them, no older girl guiding a younger hand across a slate. These children already knew their letters years before most of Eliza's neighbours ever set foot inside a classroom, taught privately at home by governesses hired specifically for the purpose. Dressed not in patched hand-me-down collars, but in something considerably finer, seated inside drawing rooms rather than chapel benches, they were at this very hour learning an entirely different set of lessons about what a proper Sunday was supposed to look like, lessons that had far less to do with reading, and a great deal more to do with which fork to use, which relative deserved a formal visit, and exactly how long a young lady was permitted to remain in a gentleman's company before someone quietly began to talk. Across town, in a house considerably larger than anything on Eliza's own street, a young woman named Charlotte Pemberton stood perfectly still, while her lady's maid adjusted the fit of her sleeve for what must have been the fourth time that morning. The dress itself had taken the better part of an hour to fasten properly, layer upon layer of silk and boning arranged with the same careful precision a mill mechanic might bring to adjusting a temperamental loom, though Charlotte would have laughed at the comparison had anyone dared suggest it in her hearing. Her father owned the very mill where Eliza's family spent 6 days a week, bent over looms and spinning frames, a fact that meant these two young women, born only a handful of streets apart from one another, had grown up inside two versions of the exact same Sunday that barely resembled each other at all. The Pembertons had already attended their own service that morning up at the old stone church on the hill we visited together earlier tonight, in the very pew their family had rented for as long as anyone in town could remember. The same arrangement we talked through when we first stood on that street corner watching the whole town sort itself in two directions. But church, for a household like theirs, was really only the opening act. The real performance of the day was still ahead of them, and it was about to begin the moment the clock struck 2. Here is a small detail I rather enjoy sharing because it tends to catch people off guard the first time they hear it. This particular ritual was called in every etiquette manual of the period the morning call, and yet quite deliberately it never once took place in the morning. In fashionable households, morning was less a measurement of actual daylight, and more a state of being referring to any hour before the main dinner of the day, which meant a proper morning call might just as easily happen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon as it would at 10. Winter and summer even carried their own separate windows for polite calling. Roughly 2 until 4 when the days grew short and dark came early, stretching to 2 until 5. Once summer light gave everyone a little more room to breathe. If that sounds a little absurd to you, you are not alone. I suspect more than one bewildered new bride found herself thoroughly confused by that particular rule during her very first season in society, arriving at a neighbour's door at what she considered a perfectly reasonable hour, only to discover she'd committed some small unspoken breach of etiquette nobody had thought to properly explain to her beforehand. Charlotte's mother had spent the better part of the previous evening reviewing a small stack of calling cards laid out across her writing desk, deciding with the seriousness of a general, planning a campaign exactly which households the family owed a visit to this particular Sunday and in precisely what order. This was not idle busy work. Visiting in a world like theirs carried real social weight. A family who called too rarely risked being quietly dropped from a neighbour's circle altogether. A family who called too eagerly, on the other hand, risked looking desperate for connections above their own station. The whole system ran on a delicate unspoken arithmetic that every young woman in Charlotte's position was expected to learn by instinct rather than instruction, absorbed simply by watching her mother navigate it year after year, Sunday after Sunday. The cards themselves deserve a moment of their own attention because they were far more than a simple courtesy. Each one carried a name elegantly printed, and depending on how a particular corner happened to be folded, when it was left with a household servant, that small crease could communicate an entire message without a single word being spoken aloud. A corner folded one way might indicate the visitor intended to call again in person later that same day. Folded another way, it might signal condolences or congratulations, or simply confirm that the visit had in fact taken place, even if the lady of the house happened to be unavailable at that particular hour. Imagine for a moment arriving at a neighbour's home only to learn the family was not receiving visitors that afternoon. Rather than simply leaving disappointed, you would hand your card to the waiting servant, fold the correct corner with practiced fingers, and walk away having still technically completed your social obligation, the crease itself standing in for a conversation that never actually happened. An entire silent language refined down to a few careful creases in a small rectangle of paper, and every family of any standing was expected to read it fluently. Can you imagine trying to manage your entire social calendar through folded paper corners, rather than a simple message on your telephone? I find myself almost grateful some days for how straightforward modern communication has become, though I will admit there is a certain elegance to the old system too. A slowness that forced people to actually think before they acted rather than firing off a thought the instant it crossed their mind. None of these rules, I should mention, were ever handed down from any official authority. There was no government office issuing guidance on the proper folding of a calling card. Instead, an entire publishing industry sprang up around exactly this need. Etiquette manuals sold in growing numbers throughout the century, written for a rapidly expanding middle class hungry to learn the unwritten rules the aristocracy had always simply absorbed by birth. Families who had recently earned their comfort through trade or industry, families very much like the Pembertons themselves, purchased these guides almost as instruction manuals for belonging, memorizing which fork preceded, which course, and precisely how long a proper visit ought to last, anxious not to betray through some small careless mistake that their money was newer than their manners. Once the visiting itself began, an entirely separate set of rules took over, governing nearly every physical detail of the encounter. A visit inside the city was expected to last no less than 10 minutes, and no more than 20 timed, almost to the second, by hostesses who had spent years perfecting the art of a graceful, unhurried exit. Seating carried its own quiet hierarchy too. An older guest was steered firmly toward the most comfortable armchair in the room. A younger man received a lesser, though still respectable, stuffed chair. A lady was shown to the sofa, every single placement calculated to communicate exactly the right blend of respect and warmth, without a single word needing to explain why. Even something as small as bringing a beloved dog along for the visit was considered poor form, on the entirely practical grounds that a dog's muddy paws or overly friendly disposition might disturb the delicate arrangement of skirts and cushions the whole room has been carefully staged around. That very afternoon, the Pemberton drawing room received exactly this kind of choreographed visit from an elderly aunt on Charlotte's father's side, a woman well into her 70s who arrived precisely on the hour, was guided immediately toward the best armchair near the fire, and spent the following 18 minutes discussing the weather, a cousin's recent engagement, and the regrettable state of the roads leading into town before rising exactly as expected, and taking her leave without a single moment of the visit feeling rushed or overstayed. Charlotte sat through the entire exchange with her hands folded properly in her lap, speaking only when addressed, directly offering the correct small laugh at the correct small joke, performing a version of polite attentiveness she had been rehearsing since she was old enough to sit still in a chair at all. There was one more rule threaded through this whole system that I think deserves mentioning, if only because it reveals something rather sharp underneath all the surface politeness. A person of lower social standing could only be formally introduced to someone of higher standing with the higher-ranking person's express permission first. And even after two people had been properly introduced, the more socially elevated party retained the right at any later meeting to simply pretend not to recognize the other person at all, a practice openly referred to at the time as cutting an acquaintance. Charlotte had watched her own mother perform this particular maneuver more than once, a polite, unhurried glance directed just slightly past someone's shoulder, acknowledging their presence with nothing more than the faintest incline of the head, enough to avoid open rudeness, while making the exact social message unmistakably clear to everyone watching. I think what strikes me most about all of this, watching it from a comfortable distance of more than a century, is how much genuine exhaustion must have hidden underneath such a polished surface. Charlotte's family had access to 6 entire days a week, that Eliza's family did not, days free of factory whistles, days spent any way they pleased inside a house full of servants, managing every practical burden on their behalf. And yet when Sunday finally arrived, the one day meant to be set apart, they filled it with a performance nearly as demanding in its own particular way as anything happening down at the mill. Correct posture, correct conversation, correct silence at correct moments. A single afternoon calculated down to the fold of a paper corner. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment. Between Eliza walking home from chapel with salted meat wrapped in a tin, and Charlotte rehearsing, which relative deserved the first visit of the afternoon, which one of these two young women do you suspect actually experienced more genuine rest on this particular Sunday? It is tempting to assume wealth automatically bought comfort, and in most practical ways, of course, it absolutely did. But rest, real rest, the kind that lets a mind properly unclench for an hour or two, does not always follow the money quite as neatly as we might expect. I would love to know your own answer to that, honestly. So tell me in the comments, which Sunday you think you would rather have lived through, and whether your answer surprises you as much as mine surprised me the first time I sat down to write it out properly. Family life itself across households like the Pembertons had taken on an almost sacred quality throughout this particular century, held up as the very foundation of a respectable, well-ordered society. Much of that ideal traced back to the royal household itself, to a queen, and her husband raising 9 children together, presented endlessly in newspapers and portraits as the model every aspiring family ought to imitate, right down to the way they were shown, gathered together at Christmas or strolling through gardens, every image quietly reinforcing the same lesson to anyone who happened to be looking. A large, close, visibly devoted family became something of a status symbol in its own right, proof that a household had both the means and the moral character to raise children properly, and Sunday, more than any other day of the week, was the stage on which that particular performance was expected to play out in full view of visiting relatives and neighbours alike. Houses like the Pembertons often kept an entire room set aside purely for leisure, and display a billiard room perhaps, or a music room with an expensive piano. Nobody quite played, as well as they claimed to both spaces existing, mainly to demonstrate that a family had achieved enough comfort to spare an entire room for something other than practical necessity. I do not say any of this to mock the Pembertons or families exactly like them, because I suspect a great deal of what they felt on a Sunday afternoon was entirely sincere. Charlotte's mother likely did care quite sincerely about the relative she visited that day. The stiffness of the ritual does not automatically erase the warmth sitting underneath it. But there is something worth noticing in how differently the exact same word rest could be lived out depending purely on which street you happen to be born on. For Eliza, rest meant stillness, quiet, and a full stomach after 6 days of noise. For Charlotte, rest still required an audience, a correct chair, and a carefully folded piece of paper to announce it properly. None of this elaborate afternoon, of course, arranged itself. Behind every perfectly timed visit, every correctly angled armchair, every door opened at precisely the right moment, to admit a guest stood an entire second household of people whose own Sunday looked nothing at all like either Eliza's or Charlotte's. Someone had ironed that silk dress before dawn. Someone had polished the very armchair the elderly aunt now sat comfortably inside. Someone stood just beyond the drawing-room door at this exact moment, ready to appear the instant a bell was rung, having already worked through most of what should have been their own single free day, quietly making sure the whole performance ran exactly as smoothly as everyone above stairs simply assumed it always would, without ever once being asked whether they minded, or whether they had a family of their own, waiting somewhere across town wondering when they might finally walk through their own front door. Her name was Nora, and she had been standing behind that drawing-room door since well before either Charlotte or her elderly aunt had settled into their carefully assigned chairs, waiting silent and upright for the small brass bell that would summon her back inside the moment fresh tea was required. She stood with her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, weight balanced evenly between both feet, a posture drilled into her so thoroughly during her first weeks in service that she barely noticed herself holding it anymore. From where she stood she could just make out the murmur of conversation drifting through the heavy door, the elderly aunt's opinion on the state of the roads, Charlotte's carefully measured little laugh at exactly the right moment. Nora was 17 years old, and she'd already been awake for nearly 9 hours by the time that particular visit even began. Let me walk you through her morning properly, because I think it deserves just as much attention as anything happening on the other side of that drawing-room door. While Eliza's household was still stirring its own small fire back to life earlier this morning, Nora had already been up in the cold dark of a servant's attic room, lighting not one fire but 6 or 7 of them moving quietly from room to room through a house still fast asleep, coaxing warmth into spaces she herself would rarely be permitted to sit inside once the family finally woke. There was an order to it learned the same hard way. Every new servant learned it fires in the family's rooms lit first, and most carefully her own tiny attic room shared with the household's other maid left, to warm itself as best it could, usually not at all until well after dark. Water needed carrying buckets of it up narrow back stairs designed specifically so a servant's presence could remain as invisible as possible to anyone using the grander staircase at the front of the house. Breakfast needed preparing. Charlotte's own elaborate dress, the one that had taken the better part of an hour to fasten properly, did not arrange itself, and neither did the drawing room Nora had swept, dusted, and arranged before a single member of the household had even opened their eyes. By the time Charlotte finally rose stretched and rang for her morning tea, an entire quiet chapter of Nora's day had already come and gone, invisible to everyone it had been performed for. Here is something worth sitting with, honestly, and I think it changes how we ought to picture this whole day we have been walking through together tonight. By the closing years of this century, something close to 1 in every 3 young women across the country between the ages of 15 and 20 found themselves working in exactly this kind of position. Domestic service was not some rare or unusual arrangement tucked away in a handful of grand estates. It was quite simply the single largest form of employment available to women anywhere in the country, larger than factory work, larger than any other trade you could name, larger even than the mill that employed Eliza's entire family. Which means that for an enormous share of young women living through this century, the story we have spent tonight telling about Eliza and Charlotte was really only 2/3 complete. There was a third version of this exact same Sunday, playing out in houses just like the Pembertons, all across the country, one considerably less discussed than either of the other two, mostly because the very people living it rarely had the time, the paper, or the audience to write any of it down. There is a quiet irony worth naming here too, one that connects directly back to something we discussed earlier tonight about labour unions fighting for a proper day of rest. Those particular protections hard won, as they were applied almost entirely to workers in mills, mines, and factories, places official enough to attract organisers, inspectors, and legislation. A private household was none of those things. Nobody stood outside the Pembertons' front door counting Nora's hours, or checking whether her single narrow window of freedom actually arrived on schedule each week. Whatever rest a servant received depended entirely on the character of the family employing her, with no law, no union, and no inspector standing anywhere behind her to insist otherwise. There is another layer to Nora's particular kind of loneliness worth naming too, one Eliza never had to carry in quite the same way. Eliza went home every single evening to the same small crowded house she'd known her entire life, surrounded by the same tired, familiar faces. Nora did not. She lived where she worked, slept in that same narrow attic room 6 nights out of 7, and saw her own mother only on these carefully rationed slivers of time measured out in hours rather than days. A servant's family in a very real sense became the household she served, whether she felt any particular warmth toward them or not, simply because there was rarely anyone else physically present to fill that role. Now, did Nora attend church that morning? She did, as it happens, though not in quite the way you might expect. She walked up the very same hill Charlotte's family had walked toward the very same stone building we visited together earlier tonight, and she sat inside the very same service beneath the very same sermon. But servants from households like the Pembertons were seated apart, tucked into a modest gallery, or a plain back pew reserved specifically for them close enough to hear every word of the very same rented pew arrangement we discussed a while ago, yet unmistakably separated from the family she served all the same. Some churches placed their servants' gallery high along the back wall, looking down over the very pews their employers occupied, below an arrangement that always struck me as almost unbearably poetic. Once you sit with it properly, the people quietly holding an entire household together, positioned literally above the family they served, and yet, in every practical sense that mattered beneath them still, I find that detail almost more striking than two entirely separate churches would have been. Nora was not simply excluded from Charlotte's world. She was placed directly inside it every single week, given just enough proximity to see exactly what she was not. Can you imagine sitting through an entire church service close enough to see the family you spent every waking hour serving, and still being reminded through nothing more than where you were told to sit, precisely where you stood in the world? I think there is something quietly instructive in that arrangement, a lesson taught without a single word ever needing to be spoken aloud, repeated once a week for years on end until it simply became the shape of things. Lunch, once the family had returned from their own service, fell entirely to Nora and the household's cook to prepare and serve, and only once those dishes has been properly washed, dried, and returned to their shelves did anything resembling free time actually arrive. The exact arrangement varied considerably from household to household, and I think that variation matters because it meant a servant's entire experience of Sunday could hinge almost completely on the particular temperament of whichever family she happened to work for. Some households granted their servants a full afternoon away every other Sunday, a generous enough arrangement that families advertising for new staff sometimes mentioned it directly, almost as a selling point. Others offered nothing at all beyond the bare minimum required by custom, expecting a servant to remain on call from the moment she woke until the moment the last candle was finally snuffed out at night. The Pembertons, to their credit, generally allowed a shorter window each week, 2 or perhaps 3 hours squeezed between the midday meal and whatever needed preparing for the evening ahead, and Nora had learned through practiced necessity exactly how to make the very most of it. That particular afternoon she did something she'd been quietly saving toward for the better part of 2 months. Rather than walking straight home to see her own mother, who lived as it happened only a handful of streets away from Eliza's own family, close enough that the two women had likely passed each other at the baker's more than once, without either quite realizing it. Nora walked instead toward a small photographer's shop that had recently opened near the market square, wearing her own carefully kept Sunday dress purchased with her own wages, rather than handed down or borrowed from anyone. The shop itself smelled faintly of chemicals she could not name, and a heavy curtain across the back window kept the light exactly as the photographer needed it dim in places, sharp and bright in others. He arranged her carefully against a painted backdrop meant to suggest a garden neither of them had ever actually stood inside, adjusted the tilt of her chin with 2 fingers, and told her not unkindly to hold perfectly still and think of something pleasant. Nora thought of her mother's face opening an envelope some weeks from now, seeing her daughter dressed properly, hair pinned neatly, looking for one single frozen moment, like exactly the kind of young woman a mother might be proud to claim. The whole process took less than a minute, though it felt considerably longer, standing so carefully still, and when it was finally finished, the photographer promised the print would be ready within the week. Payment due in full before she left, a full week's worth of careful saving handed over without a moment's hesitation, and that particular detail matters more than it might first appear. Unlike Eliza's family stretching every single coin toward food and coal, a servant living under her employer's roof, fed and housed as part of her wage often, found herself with a small, genuine surplus at the end of each month, modest but entirely her own to spend any way she chose. Some spent it sending money home, others saved carefully toward exactly this kind of small private luxury. A single photograph taken once meant to travel by post to a mother who might otherwise never see her daughter, dressed in anything but a plain practical uniform. I think that image deserves a moment of real stillness before we move on from it. A young woman exhausted from 9 hours of labour, before the church bells had even finished ringing, spending her one narrow window of freedom not resting, not visiting, but standing carefully still in front of a camera, hoping to capture proof sent home through the post that she was still underneath the apron and the uniform, someone worth remembering exactly as she wished to be seen. We have now walked through 3 entirely different versions of this same single Sunday, and I think it is worth holding all 3 side by side for just a moment before we move any further. Eliza's Sunday hard-earned through 6 days of genuine exhaustion, filled with salted meat chapel hymns and a stillness that belonged entirely to her family alone. Charlotte's Sunday comfortable in every material sense, yet performed almost as rigidly as any factory shift. Correct chairs and correct conversation standing in for real rest. And Nora's Sunday sitting quietly underneath both of theirs, propping up every single moment of comfort either family enjoyed, allowed only the narrowest sliver of the day to call entirely her own. None of these 3 young women would have described their own Sunday as easy, and I do not think any of them would have wanted to trade places with either of the other 2, not fully, not once you understand the whole picture behind each version. Eliza had freedom, but almost nothing in the way of comfort. Charlotte had comfort, but almost nothing in the way of genuine freedom. Nora had neither, and yet somehow still found her own small pocket of dignity inside a single photograph she had paid for entirely herself. Which of these 3, I wonder, would you have least expected to still find a reason for hope inside her own small stolen hours? I know which one moves me the most, and I suspect if you sit with it honestly for a moment it might be the same one for you. I would love to hear which of these 3 Sundays struck you hardest, so do tell me in the comments before you drift off tonight. By the later years of this century, though, something was beginning to shift quietly at first in ways that would eventually touch every single household we've spent tonight, walking through wealthy and poor alike. A new kind of machine had started stretching its iron tracks across the entire country, connecting mill towns exactly like Eliza's to places most of the people living in them had only ever heard described second-hand coastlines, cities horizons wider than any chimney stack had ever allowed them to imagine. And it was about to hand even someone like Nora, someone like Eliza, an entirely different way of spending the one narrow window of freedom a Sunday could still offer, one that had nothing at all to do with salted meat folded calling cards or a servants' gallery tucked quietly along the back wall of a church. That iron track eventually reached Eliza's own town too, laid down within her own lifetime, close enough to the mill that the whistle of an approaching train sometimes drifted through the very same walls that usually carried nothing but the roar of the looms. At first, most people in town regarded the whole contraption with a healthy dose of suspicion, muttering that no good could come of travelling faster than a horse could comfortably gallop, that the human body was simply never built to withstand such speed without some lasting harm. Within a few short years, that same suspicion had softened into something closer to fascination, and then eventually into genuine excitement. And once a year on one particular Sunday, set aside specifically for the occasion, that whistle meant something entirely different from the usual grinding rhythm of the working week. It meant the entire mill was shutting its doors not for rest exactly, but for something that felt to Eliza at least almost more thrilling than rest itself. The first time Eliza ever boarded a train, she was 19 years old, and I want you to sit with that fact for a moment before we go any further, because I think it says something rather remarkable about the world she'd grown up inside. 19 years spent almost entirely within a handful of streets, a Miller chapel and a canal path, and then in the space of a single morning, an entire coastline she had only ever heard. Described second-hand suddenly became reachable in a matter of hours. Her own mother had never once seen the sea in her entire life, a fact Eliza only fully understood the moment she watched the woman's face change, standing on that platform staring down the length of track, as though trying to decide whether to trust it. Her family's excursion that particular year was organised through the mill itself. One of the more generous gestures an employer of this period might offer, a single, discounted day trip to the coast tickets purchased in bulk and handed out among the workers as something between a reward and a rare kindness. The carriage Eliza and her family climbed into that morning was not by any modern standard particularly comfortable. Wooden benches, no cushioning, to speak of open sides on some of the older carriages still in service during the earlier decades of this practice, cold air rushing straight through as the train gathered speed closer in spirit transporting cattle than passengers, if I am being completely honest with you. It was only after new regulation arrived partway through the century, requiring every train to include enclosed third-class carriages, rather than open ones, that a journey like Eliza's became something resembling an actual, weatherproof experience rather than an endurance test. None of that discomfort seemed to matter much once the train actually began moving, though. Eliza pressed her face nearly flat against the glass, watching mill towns and green fields blur past, faster than she had ever seen anything move in her entire life, faster than a horse, faster. She was fairly certain that anything ought reasonably to travel. Her younger brother, now old enough himself to be nearly as tall as she was, kept up, a steady, breathless commentary on every cow, every church spire, every stranger's face that flashed briefly past the window before disappearing again. Now here is a small correction I think is worth making before we go any further, because it is one of those historical mix-ups that has quietly hardened into popular belief, despite not being entirely accurate. If you asked most people today who invented the railway excursion, a great many would confidently answer with a single famous name, a man whose surname now appears on travel agencies and package holidays across half the world. And it is true that this man did organise an early temperance excursion in the early 1840s, carrying a group of passengers a short distance for a modest fare and outing that would eventually grow into an enormous international business bearing his name to this very day. But research into surviving newspaper archives and excursion handbills from this exact period tells a rather different story than the tidy legend suggests. Ordinary excursion trains had already been running for close to a decade before his famous trip, organised not by any single visionary entrepreneur but by the railway companies themselves, chasing straightforward profit alongside church groups, temperance societies and mechanics institutes eager to give their members something wholesome to do with a day off. As early as the summer of 1835, more than 1,000 curious passengers crowded aboard a train for a journey of barely 2 miles along a newly opened line, many of them simply riding the short stretch, back and forth for the sheer novelty of the sensation, years before our famous gentleman ever organised his own considerably smaller outing. One particularly enormous excursion in the summer of 1840 carried something close to 3,000 passengers between 2 English towns in a single train stretched across dozens of carriages pulled by 4 separate engines working together. I find that little correction rather satisfying to share. Honestly, because history does love collapsing an entire messy, collective movement down into one convenient name, and the real story spread across hundreds of ordinary organisers Nobody remembers. Today strikes me as considerably more interesting than the simplified version we usually get handed. There is a more serious thread running underneath all of this too, one that connects directly back to an argument we spent real time on earlier tonight. Not every excursion train met with universal approval, and Sunday excursions specifically drew far sharper criticism than trips run on any other day of the week. The very same voices that had argued so fiercely over whether a museum ought to open its doors on a Sunday found an even more direct target in these crowded seaside trains, arguing that filling England's one sacred day of rest with steam crowds and noisy amusement represented exactly the kind of moral drift they'd been warning against for years. Some railway companies wary of stirring up exactly this kind of criticism quietly avoided scheduling their largest, most popular excursions on a Sunday, at all choosing instead to run them on a Saturday afternoon. Once shorter working hours made that possible, a small, practical compromise that let working families enjoy the outing without dragging the railway itself directly into an argument it had little interest in fighting. And there was a genuine safety concern tangled up inside that same criticism too, one that deserves honest mention, rather than a polite skip past it. Working-class women travelling on these early excursions, particularly in the more crowded, poorly lit carriages of the earlier decades, sometimes faced real harassment from men taking advantage of tight quarters and jostling crowds, and a woman travelling without a chaperone arriving home after dark risked a kind of public judgment about her character that a man in the exact same situation never once had to consider. Despite all of that very real risk, women kept boarding these trains anyway in enormous numbers, because the alternative, a lifetime spent never once seeing anything beyond their own town, weighed heavier than the risk itself. Can you imagine weighing your own safety against your only real chance at seeing the sea for the very first time? I do not think that is a fair trade for anyone to have to make. And yet for so many women exactly like Eliza, it was simply the only door available, and they walk through it anyway. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we leave that crowded, salt-scented platform behind, because it touches almost every thread we've followed together tonight. Squeezed into those same uncomfortable third-class carriages, alongside mill hands and servants and shopkeepers' daughters sat people who on any ordinary Sunday would never have shared so much as a church pew with someone like Eliza, let alone a bench seat for several hours running. Contemporary observers of the period noted with a certain surprise how thoroughly these crowded excursions seemed to soften the sharp class lines the rest of the week kept so carefully drawn, everyone equally jostled, equally sooty, equally delighted at the first glimpse of open water through a grimy window. It did not erase those old lines permanently. Not by any means. We have already spent enough of tonight together to know better than to believe that. But for one crowded carriage ride on one particular day, the usual careful sorting of who sat where, who spoke to whom, and who deserved which chair simply did not seem to matter in quite the same way it did everywhere else. By the time Eliza's train finally slowed into a small coastal station, salt air replacing coal smoke for the first time in her entire life, she'd already decided the whole uncomfortable journey had been worth it several times over. The town itself had transformed almost entirely around visitors, just like her fishing villages that had spent centuries quietly hauling in their catch, suddenly reshaped into something closer to an enormous, cheerful carnival. Wooden bathing machines stood lined along the shore, small-wheeled huts that allowed a modest Victorian woman to change into her heavy woolen bathing costume and be rolled directly into the water without ever once being seen doing so. From the beach, an arrangement that struck Eliza as equal parts sensible and faintly ridiculous, though she climbed inside one gladly enough when her turn finally came. Vendors sold ice cream from small carts, an experience so novel to Eliza that she could not quite decide upon her first taste whether she loved it or simply could not properly believe it existed at all, cold in a way nothing she'd ever eaten before had prepared her for. Somewhere nearby, a Punch and Judy show drew a crowd of shrieking, delighted children, her own brother among them, laughing at exactly the same puppet violence that had apparently delighted English children on beaches, just like this one for generations already. And further along a small stall sold sticks of brightly coloured candy, sweet enough to make her teeth ache pleasantly for the rest of the afternoon. I have come across one particular detail from this era that I think captures the sheer scale of what these excursions eventually became better than almost anything else. In one Wiltshire town built almost entirely around a single railway works, the annual excursion to the coast grew so popular that something close to half the entire population of the town boarded the very same train. On the very same day, an entire community essentially emptying itself out for one single shared day by the sea, leaving the streets back home nearly silent until everyone returned sunburned and exhausted late that same evening. Shopkeepers closed early. Doors sat unlocked in a way that would have seemed unthinkable any other week of the year, since there was hardly anyone left in town worth locking a door against. Try picturing that for a moment, your entire hometown, shop, streets and all simply emptying itself out onto a single train once a year. Would your own town have that kind of nerve? Do you think, or does that sound more like chaos than celebration to you? I think what moves me most about this whole chapter of the story is not really the ice cream or the bathing machines, at all charming as those details are. It is what the railway quietly did to the entire shape of what a single free day could even mean for someone like Eliza. For her entire childhood, Sunday had meant her own street, her own chapel, her own small familiar world walked and re-walked so many times she likely could have traced its exact borders with her eyes shut. And then almost overnight, that same one single day expanded to include an entire coastline she had never known existed in any real physical sense, only in second-hand descriptions from travellers passing through town. The rules governing how a Sunday ought to be spent had not fully disappeared, not by any means, but the geography available to spend it inside had cracked wide open, and once a person has seen the sea for the first time, I do not think they ever quite picture their own town or their own life in exactly the same small way again. I wonder if you had grown up never once leaving your own hometown until your 19th year, what you imagine the sea would have looked like in your own mind beforehand, and whether the real thing would have matched it at all. Not every family living through this century experienced anything close to Eliza's excursion though, and I think it is worth remembering as we travel further into this story tonight that an ocean away, an entirely different rhythm still governed how the vast majority of ordinary people actually spent their Sunday. No railway whistle at all, no coastline waiting at the end of the line, no ice cream, no bathing machines, no crowded carriage rattling towards salt air and noise. Only fields animals and a very different kind of quiet stretching out in every direction as far as the eye could see, on the other side of an entire ocean where the seventh day of the week answered to nobody's factory bell at all. Her name was Ruth Colby, and if you had asked her on any given Sunday morning in 1874 how far the nearest neighbour lived from her family's small sod house, out on the Nebraska prairie, she likely would have needed a moment to actually calculate it, since the answer involved several miles of open grassland rather than a simple walk down a shared street. The house itself was built directly from the earth. It sat upon thick blocks of prairie sod, stacked and packed into walls a full 2 feet deep, since lumber was scarce enough out here that most families simply built with whatever the land itself provided. From her own front step, Ruth could turn in a slow, complete circle and see nothing at all resembling a neighbour's roof, only grass sky, and the kind of horizon that seemed to stretch on well past the edge of what her eyes could properly measure. This was a version of Sunday that had almost nothing in common with anything we have followed together tonight so far. Not the crowded chapel benches, not the folded calling cards, not even the salt-scented seaside crowds. Out here, an entirely different arithmetic governed how a family experienced its one sacred day of the week, and that arithmetic began with an uncomfortable, unavoidable fact: space. Ruth's family did not live near a church at all, not in any convenient sense. The nearest proper building set aside purely for worship sat close to 2 hours away by wagon, assuming the weather cooperated and the horses were feeling generous, which on the open prairie could never quite be taken for granted. So the Colby family, like a great many homesteading families scattered across the American frontier during exactly these decades, rose before dawn on a Sunday, not for chores, though those still waited regardless, but to begin the long, jolting journey across open country toward whatever gathering happened to be planned for that particular week. The wagon itself offered little in the way of comfort, a hard wooden bench beneath them, and nothing overhead but open sky, and Ruth had long since learned to brace her feet a certain way against the floorboards to keep from being thrown sideways every time a wheel caught a rut hidden in the tall grass. Her younger siblings usually slept through most of the journey curled together under a shared blanket, while her father kept a steady, watchful eye on the horizon for any sign of weather turning against them, since a sudden prairie storm could transform a pleasant 2-hour ride into something considerably more dangerous within the space of a single afternoon. And I want to underline that phrase happened to be planned because it carries far more weight out here than it ever did back in Eliza's crowded little mill town. Churches on the frontier rarely had the luxury of their own full-time preacher living comfortably down the road. Instead, an entire circuit of scattered communities shared a single travelling minister, between them a man who rode from settlement to settlement on a rotating schedule, sometimes covering a circuit that spanned dozens of miles and half a dozen small congregations, meaning any particular family might only see an actual ordained preacher once every 3 or 4 weeks, sometimes longer, if rivers ran high or snow made the trails impassable. Denomination out here mattered considerably less than it did back in a settled town, with its stone parish church and its separate brick chapel, standing barely a mile apart. A Methodist circuit rider might just as easily preach to a barn full of families raised Baptist, Presbyterian, or something else entirely, and nobody thought much of gathering together regardless, since the nearest alternative service might be an entire day's ride further still. Can you imagine planning your entire spiritual and social calendar round whether a single travelling horseman managed to make it through the weather? That particular month, I find it almost impossible to picture, especially set against everything we watched happen inside Eliza's own crowded chapel, packed shoulder to shoulder with the very same faces every single week without fail. On the Sundays when no preacher arrived at all, and there were plenty of those families did not simply cancel the gathering, they held it anyway, taking turns leading their own scripture readings and hymns among themselves, a self-organized, thoroughly democratic little service that asked nothing of anyone beyond a willingness to stand up and read aloud in front of neighbours they might not see again for weeks. A father might take charge one week, a respected elder the next, occasionally even a capable older daughter, since necessity out here had a way of loosening rules that would have seemed unthinkable in a more established parish back east, or across the ocean, in a place like Eliza's own town. I find something rather moving in that particular detail, honestly. Faith out here did not depend on any single official figure showing up to authorize it. It survived on stubbornness and shared effort alone, exactly the same qualities that had gotten most of these families out to the frontier in the first place. When the circuit preacher did manage to arrive, though, it transformed the entire week around it into something close to a small festival. Word would travel days ahead past farm to farm by whoever happened to be riding into town for supplies, and families would plan their entire Sunday dinner around the honour of hosting him at their own table. Chicken more often than not, since a chicken could be spared from the flock without threatening the family's whole livelihood, the way a larger animal might roasted or fried, depending on the household served, alongside whatever vegetables the garden had managed to produce that particular season. Perhaps a jar of preserves saved specifically for exactly this kind of occasion rather than an ordinary meal. Ruth's mother would spend the better part of Saturday preparing for a visit that might last only a few hours, sweeping the small sod house floor twice over, setting out the family's one good tablecloth. Nervous in a way she rarely allowed herself to be about anything else. The preacher ate first and best a guest of genuine importance in a world where actual visitors of any kind were desperately rare, and children who had spent weeks with almost no company beyond their own siblings suddenly found themselves peppering a total stranger with questions about towns and places they had only ever heard described second-hand. What was the nearest real city like? Had he seen a train up close? Did he know whether the war back east was truly finished for good? A single travelling man, tired from days on horseback, and probably hoping mostly for a hot meal and a soft chair, found himself instead at the centre of an entire family's starved curiosity about the wider world, and most by all accounts seemed to bear the attention with remarkable patience. Here is the piece of this story I think deserves the most honest attention of all, though because it cuts directly against how peacefully we tend to picture a day of rest. No matter how far the family travelled for church, no matter how special the visiting preacher's dinner turned out to be, the animals back home never once received word that this was supposed to be a sacred day. Cows still needed milking both morning and evening, roughly 12 hours apart, since a cow left unmilked too long did not simply wait patiently until her owner found a convenient moment. Chickens still needed feeding, and their eggs still needed gathering before some hungry prairie creature found them first. Horses still needed watering, especially the very team that had just spent 2 hours pulling a loaded wagon across rough ground and back again. A homesteading family could stretch, bend, and rearrange nearly every other part of their week around Sunday's demands, but livestock simply did not negotiate, and a missed milking was not a small inconvenience. It was lost income, spoiled udders, and very real financial strain for a family already balanced on the thinnest possible margin. That meant someone, usually whichever son or daughter was old enough to be trusted with the task alone, rose earlier than everyone else. That morning moved through the milking and feeding by lantern light before the family even climbed into the wagon, and repeated the entire routine again the moment they returned home that evening, exhausted from travel often well after dark. Neighbouring families sometimes worked out a quiet arrangement between themselves for exactly this reason, taking turns watching over each other's stock during the longer Sunday gatherings, one family's eldest son riding a wide loop between 2 or 3 neighbouring farms to check on animals while everyone else prayed and visited, a small act of mutual trust that says a great deal about how tightly these scattered, distant families still depended on one another, despite the miles standing between them. Ruth herself had taken on this particular duty more times than she could easily count, hands moving through the familiar motion of milking half asleep. The barn's warm animals smell a strange quiet contrast to the crisp formality of whatever service she had just attended hours earlier. There was something almost meditative in it. She'd come to realize this small necessary labour book, ending an otherwise sacred day, a reminder that rest out here was never entirely absolute, only carefully, deliberately reduced down to its barest possible shape. So an entire quiet compromise grew up around this tension, rarely written down anywhere, simply understood and passed along the same way most frontier wisdom travelled. The absolute minimum of chores got done morning and evening quickly and without ceremony, and everything else that could possibly wait until Monday waited. No mending, no ploughing, no trips into town for supplies unless truly urgent. It was rest built entirely around necessity's edges, rather than rest as any kind of pure, uninterrupted stillness, a version of the sacred day shaped less by scripture and more by the blunt, practical reality of keeping animals alive on an unforgiving stretch of land. I think what strikes me most, turning this particular version of Sunday over in my mind next to everything else we've discussed tonight, is just how differently isolation shaped the entire meaning of the word rest. Back in Eliza's town, Sunday overflowed with people, crowded chapels, calling cards passed door to door, an entire street spilling out onto the road together after morning service. Out here on the prairie, rest looked almost entirely inward, a single family alone on an enormous stretch of grassland, doing what little they could to mark the day as different from the 6 around it, mostly through the sheer effort required just to reach whatever gathering existed at all. In one world, Sunday meant too many eyes watching your every move. In the other, it meant almost nobody watching at all for weeks at a stretch, until a single gathering suddenly reminded an entire scattered community that other people still existed in the world beyond their own fence line. Which kind of Sunday do you suspect you would have found lonelier? I wonder one crowded with rules and neighbours watching your every move, or one so vast and empty that a single travelling stranger felt like genuine cause for celebration. I would love to hear your own answer to that in the comments, honestly, because I still find myself changing my mind on it depending on the day. Ruth's own mother, a woman who worked the garden, the kitchen, and half the barn chores across an ordinary week without complaint, found precious little actual rest on a Sunday either, if I am honest with you about it. Dinner for whatever number of guests happened to gather that week still needed cooking. Dishes still needed washing afterward. The particular exhaustion of frontier womanhood rarely paused simply because a preacher happened to be seated at the table, and Ruth, watching her mother move through that entire long day without a single moment fully her own, quietly understood even as a girl that womanhood out here carried its own separate unspoken definition of what a day of rest was actually permitted to include. And yet, for all that hardship, there was something Ruth truly treasured about these rare gathered Sundays too, something worth holding on to before we move any further into this story tonight. Because when families from miles apart finally did manage to gather in one place, whether around a travelling preacher's borrowed pulpit, or simply a neighbour's front porch, that single afternoon became the one real opportunity for an entire scattered generation of young people to actually meet one another at all. A boy from a homestead 10 miles in one direction, a girl from a claim 8 miles in another, otherwise perfect strangers to each other for weeks on end, suddenly standing within speaking distance, dressed in whatever passed for their own good clothes, keenly aware that this particular gathering might be their only real chance, for months to exchange more than a passing wave across an empty field. That same quiet truth as it happens held just as firmly back across the ocean in Eliza's own crowded little world, even if the reasons behind it looked entirely different on the surface. Whether a young person's Sunday unfolded across miles of empty prairie, or along a single familiar street lined with chapels and mill gates, this one protected day kept turning out to be something else entirely. 2. Something we have not yet properly spoken about tonight. The one real chance hidden inside all the rules and the rituals for a person to fall in love. Out on that Nebraska prairie, the boy from the homestead 10 miles in one direction did in fact eventually work up the nerve to speak properly with the girl from the claim 8 miles in the other, and by most accounts it took him nearly a full season of circuit preacher Sundays to manage it, trading a handful of awkward sentences after each gathering, before finally riding the extra distance to her family's own front step one particular Sunday afternoon, hat in hand, praying her father would be in a generous mood. Courtship out there rarely involved long private conversations at all, if I am honest with you about it, since privacy itself was a luxury that particular landscape did not easily provide. More often, it meant simply being present week after scattered week, standing close enough at a gathering to be noticed, offering to help unhitch a wagon, or carry a dish to the table, small gestures that across enough repeated Sundays eventually added up to something resembling an understanding between two families as much as two individuals. Distance, as it turns out, has a way of making a person patient. When your entire courtship depends on a preacher's unpredictable travel schedule, you learn rather quickly not to rush anything, because rushing was never really an option in the first place. Back across the ocean in Eliza's own crowded little corner of England, love operated according to an entirely different set of unwritten rules, though Sunday remained in every single version of this story we have followed together tonight. The one day flexible enough to make any of it possible at all. Among working families exactly like Eliza's courtship carried a name of its own, a phrase you may have heard before without quite knowing its full weight. Walking out. It meant more or less precisely what it sounds like. A young man and a young woman having caught one another's attention at chapel at the mill gate, or perhaps at one of the singing clubs. So many working communities organised for themselves would begin appearing together on Sunday afternoons, strolling the same canal path Eliza herself knew so well in full view of an entire street that missed absolutely nothing. Once a couple had progressed from simply speaking to properly walking out together, and further still to what the neighbourhood understood as keeping company. Everyone on that street considered the relationship settled enough to discuss openly, congratulations offered well before any formal engagement had actually been announced by either family. There was no formal chaperone required by law or custom, not the way Charlotte's world demanded one, and yet I would argue the arrangement was watched over just as carefully only by dozens of pairs of eyes, rather than one single appointed guardian. Every neighbour leaning against a doorframe, every mother beating a rug over a windowsill functioned as an informal witness to exactly how respectably or how carelessly a courtship happened to be conducted. Here is where I think Eliza's own story gives us something rather delightful to work with, because her younger brother, the very same one who spent an entire church service tracking a beetle across the floor several parts ago tonight, eventually found himself drafted into a role that had absolutely nothing to do with beetles at all. Once Eliza herself began walking out with a young mechanic from a neighbouring workshop, her mother insisted quite firmly that the boy accompany his sister on these particular Sunday strolls, trailing a respectable 10 paces behind the couple, theoretically present to preserve propriety, practically present mostly to complain about being dragged along at all. This particular arrangement carried its own charming nickname among working families of the period, playing gooseberry, a phrase used specifically for the unfortunate younger sibling stuck tagging along on someone else's romance, presumably because he stood there about as welcome and about as decorative as the bitter little fruit itself. Eliza's brother performed this duty with all the enthusiasm you might expect from a boy who considered himself entirely too mature for such nonsense, groaning theatrically each time he was informed of the assignment, dragging his feet the entire length of the canal path, loudly wondering aloud whether the pair of them intended to walk all the way to the coast at this rate. The young mechanic, to his credit, quickly learned that a small paper twist of sweets purchased on the way transformed a reluctant chaperone into a considerably more agreeable one, at least of the length of a single Sunday afternoon. I suspect, if pressed honestly, the boy rather enjoyed the extra attention lavished on him, purely to keep him quiet and sufficiently distracted. Can you picture it properly? A young couple trying their very best to hold something resembling a private conversation, while a resentful younger brother trails just close enough behind to make certain nothing untoward happens, loudly announcing his boredom every few minutes, purely to remind everyone he was still there. Would you rather have had a chaperone like that, a bored little brother easily bribed with sweets, or the far stricter, far more watchful sort Charlotte's world insisted upon? I know which one I would have preferred, and I suspect it is the same one most of you would pick too. I think there is something wonderfully human about that particular compromise, honestly a system built not on rigid legal enforcement, but on the much simpler, much messier logic of family community, and one thoroughly unimpressed 12-year-old boy standing in for an entire moral code. Now let me walk you across town again, back into Charlotte's considerably more formal world, because the contrast here deserves proper attention. A young woman of Charlotte's standing did not simply begin walking out with whoever happened to catch her eye at a Sunday gathering. Her entire path toward courtship had been mapped out quite literally from the moment she formally entered society, an event itself carefully staged once a young woman reached roughly 17 or 18 years of age, complete with a new wardrobe purchased specifically for the occasion, and an official introduction to what the period rather bluntly referred to as the marriage market. A young man hoping to court Charlotte properly could not simply approach her directly, no matter how respectable his intentions, without first securing an introduction through someone already known to both families, a rule so firmly enforced that an unsanctioned conversation between two unmarried strangers, brief as it might be, could seriously damage a young woman's reputation if witnessed by the wrong pair of eyes. From that point forward, courtship advanced through carefully graduated stages. First, simple conversation permitted only through that proper introduction. Then, if that conversation went well, walking out together, though even that stage bore almost no resemblance to Eliza's canal path strolls. A chaperone, older, respectable, and almost always present, accompanied Charlotte at every single stage of any budding romance, and physical contact remained restricted to the barest necessity. A gentleman's offered hand across an uneven patch of ground, representing very nearly the outer limit of what propriety allowed, before any formal understanding had been reached between two families. I find it fascinating and honestly a little bit funny that young women navigating this particular world eventually developed their own quiet language to work around such heavy supervision. A closed fan held a certain way, an open fan angled just so entire small conversations conducted silently across a crowded drawing room, using nothing more than the tilt of a folded fan understood perfectly by anyone raised inside that particular code, and utterly invisible to any chaperone watching the room. Rules this strict, it turns out, rarely stop young people from finding some clever workaround. They simply push the workaround further underground, dressed up in a language subtle enough to escape detection entirely. And underneath all of these differing rules sat a deeper difference too, one worth naming plainly. For a family like Charlotte's, marriage still carried real weight, as a matter of property connection and social advancement, a union between two households nearly as much as two individuals, even as the century increasingly celebrated the idea of marrying purely for love. For a family like Eliza's, with comparatively little property or status to protect in the first place, that particular pressure simply mattered less. A mechanic's steady wage and a kind temperament counted for a great deal more than which family he happened to be born into, and I suspect that freedom, small as it might look, set against everything Charlotte's world demanded, was its own quiet kind of privilege in return. That growing appetite for romance, purely for its own sake, regardless of class, found a rather charming outlet in the printed word too, as cheaper paper and faster presses made it possible for the very first time for ordinary young people to send one another a small, affordable card expressing feelings they might never have dared say aloud in person. A shy young man who could barely manage 2 full sentences during an actual Sunday walk might, given a pen a quiet evening and a printed card purchased for a few pence, suddenly find himself considerably more eloquent on paper than he had ever once managed out loud. Eliza herself kept one such card carefully pressed flat inside the same small wooden chest that held her Sunday dress sent to her early in her own courtship, its ink slightly faded now, its sentiment, whatever it happened to say, apparently still worth keeping years later. There is a third version of Sunday courtship worth mentioning too, one considerably harder than either of the other two, and I think it deserves its own honest moment before we move any further tonight. For someone like Nora, squeezed into that narrow window of freedom we spent real time discussing a while back, courtship of any kind had to fit inside an already impossibly small allowance of hours, stolen between washing the family's lunch and dishes and returning in time to help prepare their evening meal. A servant hoping to walk out with anyone at all needed both genuine affection and remarkably precise timekeeping, since arriving back even a few minutes late risked far more than an awkward conversation with an employer. It risked the position itself, and with it the roof over her head and the wages her own family had likely come to depend on too. Many households in fact actively discourage their servants from courting at all, quietly preferring an unmarried staff who could be relied upon to prioritize the family's needs over their own. A servant who did fall in love and eventually chose to marry generally understood without needing to be told outright that her position would not survive the wedding, since a married woman was expected to manage a household of her own rather than someone else's. Romance for a young woman living entirely inside someone else's household demanded a kind of quiet, careful discipline that neither Eliza nor Charlotte ever fully had to master in quite the same way, weighing not only her own heart, but her entire livelihood against every stolen hour spent walking beside someone she cared for. What strikes me most, laying all 4 of these stories side by side tonight, Prairie Mill Town drawing room and servants' quarters, is how completely different the actual mechanics of courtship looked in each one, and yet how stubbornly Sunday kept surfacing again and again as the one single thread connecting every version of it. Every single class we have walked through tonight built its own particular fence around love-tall stone walls in Charlotte's world, a loose hedge of neighbourly gossip in Eliza's, an almost impossibly narrow gate in Nora's, sheer distance itself in Ruth's. And yet somehow on every single side of every single fence people kept finding their way through anyway, because that particular instinct, it turns out, rarely waits patiently for anyone's permission. Whether love had to survive a 10-mile ride on horseback, a resentful younger brother trailing 10 paces behind a carefully coded fan, or a strictly rationed hour stolen between chores, this one protected day remained across every class and every corner of this story, the narrow crack in an otherwise relentless week wide enough for 2 people to actually find one another. I wonder which version of that courtship you think you would have found hardest to navigate. Honestly, the constant supervision, the constant distance, or the constant clock ticking down towards someone else's dinner. Tell me in the comments, because I still cannot decide which one I would have found more nerve-wracking myself, and I suspect your answer might depend entirely on whether you consider yourself a patient person or not. By now, the light outside every single one of these homes we have visited together tonight The sod house, the Milltown street, the grand drawing room, and the servants' quarters tucked above it, had begun its slow, familiar slide toward evening, the particular gold and grey of a Sunday finally winding down toward its end. Fires were being built back up against the coming chill. Wagons were being unhitched. Somewhere a chaperoned young couple said their careful, formal goodbyes on a doorstep, while somewhere else a mechanic walked a slightly less formal young woman home along a darkening canal path trailed at a respectful distance by a brother who had by this point in the afternoon finally run out of complaints. And it is there in that softening light settling gently over every household we've followed together tonight that our story has one last quiet room left to visit. Back inside Eliza's own small house, the fire her mother had coaxed to life so many hours ago that morning had settled into something quieter now, a low steady glow rather than the bright urgent flame it needed to be at dawn. Her father sat mending a boot by its light needle, and thick thread pulled through leather gone soft with wear, a task that technically counted as work, though nobody in that house would ever have called it that on a Sunday evening, since keeping a single pair of boots serviceable through another 6 days of mill labour felt closer to simple survival than anything resembling proper toil. Her mother sat close beside him, a basket of stockings in need of darning balanced on her knee needle, moving steadily by habit, more than close attention, her eyes drifting occasionally toward the window and whatever thoughts a long day tends to leave behind. Eliza herself sat nearest that same window, a borrowed book open on her lap, the very same kind of reading she'd first learned inside a crowded little Sunday school classroom years earlier, tracing each line slowly, still savouring the particular pleasure of a skill that had once felt entirely out of reach for someone in her position. Her younger brother had long since fallen asleep on the floor near the hearth, worn out from an entire day of church dinner chores and one long tedious afternoon spent trailing his sister and her young man along the canal path, one arm flung dramatically over his own face, as though even sleep required a certain amount of theatre from it. Nobody spoke very much. Nobody needed to. This particular quiet, the kind that settles into a room once every obligation of the day has finally been met, felt entirely different from the silence of early morning we sat inside together when this story first began. That earlier quiet had been full of anticipation, a whole day still waiting to happen. This one was full of something closer to satisfaction. The particular stillness that only arrives once a day has actually been lived, rather than simply endured. Across town in the Pemberton household evening arrived with rather more ceremony attached to it, as you might expect by now. Charlotte sat at the piano in that same music room we visited earlier, playing something quiet and unremarkable, mostly for her own comfort rather than any audience. The elaborate silk dress she'd worn all afternoon finally exchanged for something softer, less demanding of her posture. Her mother reviewed tomorrow's household accounts by lamplight nearby, already thinking ahead to the ordinary week, resuming at dawn the elderly aunt's visit, and the whole afternoon's careful performance, already folding itself neatly back into memory, ready to be repeated again in some slightly different arrangement come next Sunday. And somewhere above them in a small attic room she shared with the household's other maid, Nora, finally sat down properly, for the first time since before sunrise, her own single candle burning low, a half-written letter to her mother resting unfinished on her knee, words she would likely finish another Sunday whenever the next narrow window of time happened to open up again. The photograph she'd paid for that very afternoon would not arrive by post for another week yet, but she had already decided, lying there in the dark, precisely which words she wanted, written on the back of it once it finally came. An ocean away on that wide dark stretch of Nebraska prairie Ruth's family gathered by their own small fire inside walls built from the very earth around them, the day's second milking finally finished, animals settled supper eaten from the same simple dishes that had welcomed a travelling preacher only a few short weeks earlier. Her father recited a passage aloud from the family Bible by lamplight, the same simple ritual the household performed, whether or not a circuit preacher had managed to reach them that particular week, faith requiring no official permission to continue quietly on its own terms. Outside, beyond the thick sod walls, the prairie stretched on in every direction, dark and enormous, and for tonight at least entirely silent. 4 households, 4 entirely different versions of the very same single day, separated by oceans, by class, by circumstance, by every measure we might use to sort human lives into neat, tidy categories. And yet, if you stood back far enough from all of it the way we have spent this whole story doing together tonight, you would notice each one arriving by whatever winding path suited its own particular circumstances at almost exactly the same place. A fire burning low, a family gathered close, or in Nora's case gathered only with her own thoughts and a half-finished letter. A day finally properly done. I think it is worth asking now that we've walked through so many corners of this single day together, what all of this actually adds up to. Because a Sunday, like the ones we just spent tonight inside, was never really just about resting, not entirely. And it was never really just about religion either, though both of those threads ran through everything we discussed. It was about a society imperfect, as it was uneven as it was deciding that a person's entire worth could not be measured only in hours worked and wages earned. That belief did not arrive all at once, and it certainly did not arrive fairly, not for Nora squeezing courtship and rest alike into a handful of stolen hours, and not for families forced to choose between 2 full-closed days and one simply because their faith happened to fall on the wrong afternoon of the week. But the belief was there all the same, stubbornly persisting underneath every single version of Sunday we walk through tonight. And it did not disappear once this particular century ended either. Think back for a moment over everything this single day demanded of the people living inside it. Rules about which chair to sit in, rules about which pew to occupy, rules about which door stayed locked and which door swung open to visitors. A whole society, in other words, spending an enormous amount of collective energy simply deciding how one single day out of 7 ought to be spent arguing over it in Parliament, in newspaper columns, in quiet conversations over a garden fence. I do not think a society argues that fiercely over something it considers unimportant. The very intensity of every disagreement we walk through tonight tells us more clearly than any single fact could just how much that one protected day actually mattered to the people living through it. By the later decades of this era, the same pressures we watched build across tonight's entire story. Workers organising reformers, arguing families quietly, insisting on their own small measure of dignity, had begun reshaping the working week itself, not only its one sacred final day. New factory legislation gradually pulled the standard working week down from the exhausting stretches Eliza's own parents had grown up inside towards something closer to what we would recognise today, a single piece of reform among many but a meaningful one, chipping steadily away at the idea that a person's entire waking life belonged by default to whoever employed them. It happened in small, unglamorous increments, an hour trimmed here, half day. Granted their decades of tedious committee debates and quiet negotiation, rather than any single dramatic victory worth putting on a banner. Saturday afternoons slowly began joining Sunday as time properly set aside for rest rather than labour, and the modern idea of an actual weekend 2 connected days rather than one hard-earned pause started quietly taking shape from exactly this kind of slow, contested progress. Eliza herself would likely never have used the word weekend in her own lifetime. The term simply did not exist yet in the way we use it now, but she was without ever quite realizing it, living through the very early unfinished draft of it. Here's what I find myself thinking about most though, turning this whole story over one final time before we let it rest tonight. We still argue about exactly this same question today, don't we? Just dressed in slightly different clothing. We call it work-life balance now instead of Sabbath observance. We argue about whether a message from a manager truly needs an answer on a Sunday evening, the same way Eliza's own town once argued about whether a museum ought to open its doors on that same day. We talk about digital detox weekends and slow Sunday rituals, deliberately setting our phones aside for a few quiet hours, without perhaps realizing how closely that impulse echoes an entire century of ordinary people fighting in ways loud and quiet alike for exactly the same basic thing. Some of us even feel our own quiet version of that old Sunday dread creeping in by evening, a heaviness settling in at the thought of Monday waiting just past midnight, not so very different from the tired heaviness Eliza's own father carried in his shoulders every single Sunday night of his working life. One day protected from the relentless pull of everything else, kept sacred not necessarily by scripture, but simply by shared agreement that a person deserves more from their life than constant uninterrupted labour. I do not think our modern version of that struggle looks quite so different from Eliza's or Charlotte's or Nora's or Ruth's, when you really sit with it properly. We have simply traded mill whistles for notification chimes, chapel benches for crowded group chats, and pew rents for the quiet unspoken pressure to always appear reachable, always available, always still somehow working, even on the one day we tell ourselves belongs entirely to rest. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying tension a person's own time pulling against everyone else's claim on it has barely changed at all. If there is a single thread worth carrying with you out of this whole story tonight, I think it might be this one. Rest has never once been something simply handed down to ordinary people. It has always had to be built, argued for, protected, and occasionally quietly stolen back one hard-won Sunday at a time, by people with far less power than the ones setting the rules around them. Every single quiet stillness we witnessed tonight, Eliza's, Charlotte's, Nora's, Ruth's, was earned by someone somewhere insisting that it mattered. I would love to know, honestly, which version of that single Sunday stayed with you the most tonight out of everyone we spent these hours walking beside. Eliza carrying warm meat home through a cold morning street, later laughing quietly at her father's nicked chin. Charlotte rehearsing precisely which relative deserved the first visit of the afternoon, folding a calling card's corner with practiced fingers. Nora spending an entire week's careful savings on one small photograph meant only for her own mother's eyes, standing perfectly still in front of a painted garden that never actually existed. Or Ruth riding 2 hours by wagon simply for the chance to hear another human voice outside her own family, milking a patient cow by lantern light before the sun had even properly risen. Whichever one settled somewhere in your chest tonight, I hope it stays there a while, the way the best stories tend to, quietly changing just slightly how you look at your own Sunday the next time it comes around. Thank you truly for spending this quiet stretch of your evening here with me tonight, walking slowly through a single day that ended nearly 2 centuries ago, and yet somehow still has quite a lot to say about the one we're all still learning to protect for ourselves. I know there are countless places your attention could have rested instead, countless other quiet corners of the internet competing for exactly this same hour of your evening, and I do not take it lightly that you chose to spend it here drifting gently through someone else's Sunday on your way toward your own night's rest. If any small piece of tonight's story found its way into you, I would love to hear about it whenever you have a spare moment, whichever household stayed with you longest, whichever small detail you find yourself still thinking about once the screen finally goes dark. And if you found yourself wanting more evenings exactly like this, one more quiet corners of history pulled gently out into the light and handed to you like a small careful gift, I hope you will come back and find me again soon. There are so many more stories waiting patiently in the dark for their own turn to be told, other centuries, other quiet lives, other small stubborn moments of rest fought for against enormous odds, and I would be glad of the company next time too. For now, though, let the fire in your own room burn a little lower. Let your own thoughts settle the way Eliza's did tonight, and let yourself rest properly, fully, exactly the way an entire century of ordinary people fought so quietly, hard to make possible for all of us. Sleep well, my friend. I will be right here waiting with another story whenever you are ready to return.